A very good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2025. And I very much hope that everybody has had a good summer. So we've got no apologies this morning. And our first item of business is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. And this is a review of the evidence that we've heard today. So are we all agreed? Thank you very much. So our next item of business this morning is to continue our inquiry into the harm caused by substance use in Scottish prisons. Now, today's session gives us the opportunity to take evidence from 2 panels of witnesses with experience of rehabilitation through care and post-release support. So I'm very pleased to welcome the following witnesses. So we have Gillian Riley, Head of Service for Alcohol and Drug Partnership Executive at NHS Scotland, Hayden Passy, Head of National Voluntary Through Care Partnership at SACRO, Mariana Marquardt, Policy and Research Officer with Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs, and Hamish Robertson, Director of Data and Insights at the WISE Group. So you're all very welcome and thank you for joining us this morning. And I refer members to papers 1 and 2. Thank you also to those witnesses who have provided written submissions. So I intend to allow up to 80 minutes for this session, and as ever, I'll begin with an opening question. So, obviously the focus of today's session is, as I said, rehabilitation through care and post-release support. However, I wonder if I can open up with a general question just to set the scene. And I'll maybe just come to Hamish first of all, and then work across the panel and ask you just for your thoughts and comments in response to my question. So the question is, to what extent is substance use in prison driven by supply-side issues? So, for example, the availability of drugs or illicit medication trading, the lucrative market associated with drugs supply in prison, set against the sort of demand-side issues, so boredom, trauma, self-medication. So to what extent is substance use in prisons driven by that sort of demand and supply effect? And what further steps can be taken to address specifically the supply side? So I'll maybe come to Hamish first.
Good morning, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to give evidence. I've got I think I've got some remarks I can provide on that, and those remarks are going to draw on kind of experience of about 12 years delivering the New Route service, which was a national service for male through care prison leavers. So there's quite a lot of experience and data from that we can pull on, as well as a long-term independent evaluation by the Fraser of Allender Institute. So with relation to substance misuse or substance use in general, New Routes, as it was, supported almost 11,000 people over 12 years. 80% of them reported having a substance use issue. And the evidence which we have through that long-ish period of time was that the primary driver was predominantly demand side. And the kind of explanations for that kind of are as follows. People predominantly reported using substances prior to incarceration, and then that was exacerbated during a period in custody. So supply side factors are clearly a contributing factor. But a kind of example of that a little bit is when we looked at the 2023 to 2024 data, about 85% of participants said that their knowledge through working with the service, their knowledge and understanding of the pros and cons of substance use was improved. Only 28% actually made progress against that while they were in custody, which probably speaks a little bit to, despite the fact that mentors on that service were doing a lot of work to engage individuals with like in-prison recovery cafes, addiction teams in prisons, NHS teams in prisons. Even with that, the progress made within custody wasn't necessarily as good as it could be. A lot of progress was made post-release, where there is a wider access to community activities, there is more freedom, there is more opportunity to work holistically on the issues which are the kind of cause of people's substance use. So I think when we looked at it, it speaks more to the supply being there to meet and exacerbate demand rather than the supply creating the demand in the first place. Probably steps that could be taken. I suppose an example of a step that could be taken, if this is appropriate, is we work out of HMP Addywell to deliver a through care service on behalf of Sodexo. So Sodexo commissioned that because they spotted certain gaps in their provision. And interestingly, the way that Sodexo run Addywell is that almost all of their work, whether that's faith-based group, whether it's education, whether it's training, or whether it is through care services, all of it is geared around the recovery pathway within the prison. And the kind of justification, the explanation of the reason they do that is because the vast majority of challenges they have in running a prison relate back to substance use in some way. Therefore, they've almost geared the whole prison delivery around ensuring people are well embedded with the recovery pathway in prison. And actually, we work across about 20 prisons in the north east and north west of England, and both private prisons and public prisons down there appear to be moving in a similar direction, where they're almost gearing all of the work in prisons around recovery pathways.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm sure that we'll come back to, how we sort of tackle that demand side of that kind of that sort of process or that issue. Okay, thank you for that. Mariana?
Yes, so from the family's perspective, something that's come out from that is it can be quite difficult to separate the supply and the demand, and they kind of work together to shape what substance use looks like in prison. So supply can change or exacerbate what substance use looks like for people, but the demand side is key because, that element of trauma, boredom, and needing to adjust to the prison environment, like you mentioned, people are always finding a way to escape that. And so there will, in speaking with families, the general idea is there will always be someone who will work to supply that demand to make money from that. And so, addressing the demand side is key. Something that's come out is, for example, someone who enters prison with an alcohol problem, and then because of the supply or readiness, the kind of readily availability of something like synthetic cannabinoids, they can't have access to alcohol, and so they then resort to using spice or synthetic cannabinoids, and so then they come out of prison with either a problem with spice or both, or kind of more complex needs that then might not be able to be addressed in the community, and then feeding into that cycle, kind of going in and out of prison. And so, that's something that shows kind of how the supply and demand work together. And so, in terms of what can be done about supply, that's not something that I have much expertise on, but really working to address that demand is something that families said is the key part of tackling substance use in prisons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's interesting that you've kind of referenced the sort of issues around, that sort of codependency, or perhaps somebody coming into prison with using alcohol, but then the kind of complexities of how that bears out in terms of perhaps their shift towards using other substances. So I'm sure we'll come back to that as well. Pauline McNeill, did you want to come in at this point, or?
Yes, I wanted to ask Mariana, good morning. I know it's a kind of running theme about the trauma and boredom that you talked about. And the committee have been exploring the issues around availability of rehabilitation programmes and things to do in prison. I get a lot of letters from prisoners, actually, saying that people are not getting access to rehabilitation. And we know that long periods of time, because of overcrowding as well, prisoners are spending too long in prison. So my question is it not about time to try and solve this side of things? giving prisoners things to do and things to aim for that could make a difference in the demand for drugs in prison?
Absolutely. I mean, I think a real key of discussion with families was the need for purposeful activity, routines, and for many people not being kept in their cells for, in some cases, kind of 23 hours a day. You know, it's, I think, something that's come out of these discussions is a need for, you know, these issues with staffing and resourcing and what the impact that has on people being able to access activities. So if there's not enough staff or if they need to be kind of redirected elsewhere, then that can have an impact on kind of, you know, mental health groups that people are able to access, or appointments, visitations. You know, I don't know if it's completely relevant to your question, but I think kind of the stigma involved in, you know, what is needed for people using substances. So things like peer support, again, kind of third sector facilitated groups and activities. These things are an essential aspect to people's health, their mental health. They're not a privilege, as some people have said. You know, they've I think families have given examples where, because of, you know, situations where people have been caught with drugs or using drugs, or altercations, things like this, kind of different situations, people have had access to visitation or activities or meetings kind of revoked from them because it's considered to be a privilege, and it's actually an essential part of people's health and recovery. And I suppose on the family side of things, having, you know, that family inclusion, being able to see family members, communicate with them, it's not only an essential part of families' well-beings, but, you know, people in prison and the recovery, it's known that that family involvement is essential to that. So, you know, I suppose, I don't know if I'm kind of rambling on, but, you know, rehabilitation, recovery, it needs to be holistic and therapeutic, and it's just not, it's not something people, especially families, are seeing consistently across the estate.
Thank you. But just the giving prisoners something to do. I mean, it's not all about rehabilitation. You talked about boredom, so presumably not having something to do. If we're interested to get people off drugs in prison, might be something to look at. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just bring in Hayden Passy, just in relation to the original question around the sort of drivers and the sort of context of supply and demand from your perspective.
Thank you. I think our experiences align with much of what's been shared today already. Certainly for us, our experience is that demand really stems from some of the experiences of trauma that many of the people that we're supporting have a background of, and that means that people are using substances as very much a coping mechanism in response to that. So we would really champion that suggestion of more of a focus around reducing demand by increasing prevention, ultimately, early intervention, and much more readily available access to treatment and the holistic treatment that Mariana has mentioned. So not purely in a medical sense, but actually bringing in the strength of recovery groups, peer support, through care provision, third sector organisations, and also to the question that MSP Pauline McNeill shared, that productive use of time, so having meaningful activities to engage in is critical in people being able to have rehabilitation and recovery safely, and prevent the use of substances as a coping mechanism. We deliver workshops with people with lived experience, and what we have often heard is that the length of time people are spending in their cell isolated and experiencing that boredom is extremely detrimental to their mental health, and we know that mental health is driving a lot of people's use of substances, and we would really advocate for better use of productive time while people are in custody, particularly for the remand population. So we do hear of many individuals who are held on remand for long periods of time with extreme uncertainty about how long they will be there. That in and of itself is hugely problematic for people's mental health and ability to cope with their time in custody, but also they do not have the same access to programmes and activities, and they're not therefore able to engage in things like work parties. They don't have that routine, and we hear that that's extremely challenging for them, and often they describe that experience in custody as one of torture. It's not humane. They feel that they have a loss of agency and choice in what's happening to them. They're not involved in the decisions that are being made about how they use their time and able to contribute to shaping what that meaningful activity would look like. Instead, often their experiences are that things are dictated to them. And I'm sure people would agree that that would be hugely compromising to your mental health, which then we see ultimately contributes to that use of substances. So we would strongly advocate for more of a systemic shift in how we approach people who are held in custody, but also address some of the alternatives to custody and prevent people from needing to go into the justice system in the first place.
Okay, thank you for that. And Julian.
Yes, thank you. So just to inform the committee that I'm head of service for the alcohol and drug recovery services in Glasgow City. So I'm more familiar with the throughput and coming out of prisons. However, the pathways into addictions is similar for people in the community as it is for prisons. Obviously, it's the loss of liberty. It's more condensed. So I do see the areas of difficulty that are there and everything that the panel members have been speaking about. One thing that I probably would like to highlight is that, yes, I do agree that we need more services, within the prison to support prisoners, to look at the activities that they're doing. And as part of community services, we are there and able to offer input into the prison systems, but the issue that we have just now is actual space. It's really difficult. We've asked if we can come in. We have a recovery cafes going to one of the prisons, but that was initially a pilot. We would want to continue that, and with the development of prison services within GG&C in Glasgow, we hope that would be taken into consideration, especially, we will go on to talk about MAT standards, but the trauma walkthrough has been trauma informed, but being able to have that space to be able to deliver, and also the staffing levels and SPA support with that. But yes, I would agree that there is more needed to go in to support that loss of identity people do experience, and the boredom round about that. If we can get in and get these services there, and then that will provide the throughput and just enhance when people are liberated and back into the community.
So I think Rona Mackay wants to come in, but just on that issue of physical space then, would it be fair to say that there's a real desire across services to support work in prisons, but it is just that practical?
Yes, we have asked, but the capacity is just not there. My colleague will be at a later committee who's the head of service for prisons and police custody, and we work very closely together as heads of service within Glasgow City, and support each other, and also the policies that are implemented. So yes, we would be wanting to see that, and the alcohol and drug recovery services and the ADP in Glasgow City are very much behind that also.
Okay, thank you for that. That's really interesting to hear that. I've not been aware of that coming up before. So I'll bring in Rona, and then I'm going to hand over to Liam Kerr.
Okay, just very briefly, it really pretty much echoes what you said, Convener. I'm just thinking when you were speaking that I don't think anybody in the prison service would disagree with a word that you're saying, and I think everybody's in agreement of that. And I think over the years there's just been a steady drop off of those services being able to happen. So, in my estimation, it must be as a result of prison overcrowding and pressure on staff. Would you agree with that? And that's something that obviously has to be addressed. Thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Liam Kerr, and then I'll bring in Shannon Dowie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll go first of all to Mariana Marquardt, and I suspect Hayden Passy, based on something you said earlier, you'll want to follow up on this. Mariana, the committee has heard evidence of a link between substance use in prisons and mental health challenges. Your call for views response raises a lack of mental health services and also suggests that there's a lack of an integration between substance use and mental health services in prison. Could you expand on this for the committee, please, and particularly what impact does inadequate provision have on both prisoners and their families?
I think it can be difficult for families to know exactly what treatment and support for their loved ones in prisons looks like, but something that they do know is that there is not a kind of holistic way of approaching mental health and substance use together. And so I suppose on the impact side of things, as we see in the community, people reach a breaking point because they're not able to have both of those needs met. You know, if someone has trauma or mental health needs or conditions that then, you know, cause them or, you know, kind of spur on that substance use, and those aren't addressed, then, you know, they'll continue to use substances, but then in using substances that can cause kind of mental health crises or, you know, cases of psychosis. And so, you know, the impact that has on people in prison, these crises, they can kind of self-harm or end up in hospital or, you know, hurt themselves or others. And so then families are left to deal with the impact of that. They have anxiety, you know, not knowing exactly the well-being of their loved ones, but knowing that something is wrong, you know, especially if there's a kind of change in the substances that person is using. They can tell maybe from speaking to them that something's not quite right, if they're acting differently or if they're in a state of stress, but they don't know exactly what is causing that. But they know that that person's mental health is really suffering and there's not much that the family member can do for them. And so the pressure that puts on loved ones, the anxiety, you know, it's, you know, real cases of people in prison being harmed, you know, physically and mentally, and family members have to deal with the fallout of that, and yet in a way that's distant, and they can't really, you know, help like they could in the community. So I suppose that's one of the main impacts on family members.
I understand. Before I bring Hayden in, can I just press you on something, Mariana? In your case reviews, you said that you can only have a drug worker or a mental health worker, not both. Now, I found that quite interesting. I think the committee will as well. Could you just explain what that practically, how that operates then?
I'm not an expert on how that actually looks in prisons. That's something that we've seen in speaking to families. So that's, you know, I don't really know the kind of mechanisms of, you know, integrated, but that's as far as we know from speaking with families, that's been their experience.
I understand. I'm grateful. Thank you. Hayden Passy.
Thank you. Before I share my views wider, I can comment on that experience as well. I have a quote actually from a woman that we worked with in our previous Through Care service, the Shine Women's Mentoring Service, and she told us of her experience where she needed to be clean, so abstaining from substance use, to be able to access mental health support. But in order to access mental health support, she needed to be clean, so she needed to not be using substances. So her words were that this provided a catch-22 situation. She was ineligible for mental health services because she was actively using substances, but in order to be able to stop using substances, she would require that mental health support. So you can see in practice how that could be really challenging for people, and although that's one woman's experience, I'm sure that would be echoed across the many thousands of people that we work with. I would agree that there is that overlap between mental health needs and substance use. We see that prevalence of mental health needs across the cohort of individuals that we support with experience of the justice system, and the impact that that has for them, in particular the significant waiting times to be able to access mental health support and specialist support. And post-COVID pandemic, we've seen increased complexity of mental health needs for the people that we work with, and greater than demand for those services. I would say in terms of the impact for us as a through care provider, that can be extremely challenging because we often ultimately are expected to bridge that gap and hold the mental health support that people may need in that time. And that's not an adequate service to address the complexity of mental health support that's required. And that's why we seek to work in partnership with those specialist services. But if people are experiencing long waiting times when they're coming out of custody and they don't have that mental health support in place pre-release, then actually as a through care provider, it's often not appropriate for us to take on those cases because we can't address and respond to the complexity of that mental health need. Many of the people that we work with have diagnoses of particular mental health disorders. For example, a high prevalence of personality disorders in the female population, and that can make the presentation of individuals quite challenging for us in terms of difficult behaviours, and for us to really understand the needs there and be able to respond to those. We do strive to provide that support, but it's critical that we can do that alongside the specialist services. So we see the need really for greater access and readily available access to mental health support, and for that pre-release planning to identify that need earlier and ensure that it's aligned so that we can do the partnership working to provide holistic support around individuals. We do also hear of many individuals telling us that prison can be used as respite, ultimately because they're struggling to cope within the community, and we want to avoid that being a scenario for anyone to feel that prison is a safer environment because it offers 3 meals a day and a roof over someone's head. But when you're dealing with extreme mental health challenges and don't have that support available, then people are really struggling in the communities that they reside in. And we do hear of individuals using prison as respite, which I hope we would agree is not appropriate. We would also add that there is sometimes a lack of training available for staff within Scottish Prison Service, as well as the wider communities, to really understand mental health issues and how people present. And sometimes what we are hearing from the people that we work with is that there are cultures and attitudes that are not supportive for people who are struggling with mental health issues, and that can lead to a lack of trust, i.e. people not and services not trusting the individual, and people in custody not being trusted for their experiences when they're seeking support, but also a lack of trust for that individual in wanting to engage with services and feeling able to ask for support, because if they don't have that trust or those genuine relationships, there can be fear of repercussions, and that is something that we advocate against. We often find that as a through care provider working with people while they're still in custody, we advocate on their behalf and often see positive results, but we shouldn't have had to advocate when that person asked first themselves. So we do see this as part of a wider cultural issue as well around understanding mental health and the needs for the population.
I understand, thank you. I'll move to Gillian Riley for the next question. Obviously, if anyone wants to come in, just indicate to me and I'll bring you in. Gillian, the committee has heard that the SPS is looking to move to a focused day model, such that staffing will be concentrated on weekday daytime hours, and between 5 to 8 in the evening, most prisoners will be locked up in cells. What do you think the impact of that being locked up during those times will be in terms of substance misuse in particular? And are there any mitigation strategies that the SPS should be considering during evenings and weekends such that these hours do not become peak times for substance misuse?
I'm sorry, I'm not that familiar with the focused day. I don't know if it's maybe something that someone else could answer. Apologies.
Interject.
Go ahead.
Hamish.
Yeah, I can start. I'll answer your question. Sorry. Answer your question in a second, Mr. Kerr. I'll also add on to just the last bit on the other question, because to put it into perspective, for the overlap between mental health and substance misuse, we looked at 12 years' worth of data from New Roots, which was looked at by Fraser Allender Institute. They found a near 100% overlap between those two issues. And that's the same actually in other services where done in the community. So I have data from another service where someone presents with an addiction challenge, they're 5.5 times more likely to have a mental health challenge simultaneously. So just to put that into perspective for the committee, and simultaneously to add to your evidence, both Hayden and Mariana's point about the people accessing both services simultaneously. Actually, I brought a similar comment. So you've got 3 out of 4 people in the panel. It was very common to hear mentors advocating for someone to access a service around mental well-being and be told, no, we can't take that person until their addiction's sorted. So I think you've got 3 out of 4 where you've got some strong evidence there. And it all talks really to the need for joined up, I guess, better joined up care at the source. So back in beginning of 2024, we went through quite a huge exercise around service redesign of what should the optimal through care service look like across the country. That involved about 140 different organisations being involved, 110 people with lived experience whose views were brought into that, 20 stakeholder engagement meetings, essentially to design how should this work. And one of the strongest findings which came from that, from all of those hundreds of conversations, was that where a large through care service is delivered, mental health, substance use and housing was actually the third one. They should be built into the service at point of source rather than it being done as an addition to it, because those 3, again, from all of that research, all those conversations, those were the 3 biggest, and they all overlap. Those were the 3 biggest issues. So rather than dealing with it after the fact, actually design a system which at point of source you bring the service integration and the system integration into the service at the start. So that probably adds on to that. And if I can, I will briefly touch on your other comment, which was just to maybe set around. I actually spoke about this a little bit before when I mentioned Addywell. So when I went to Addywell a few months ago and I understood about their model of recovery, one of the things which came up a lot was quite a lot of their interventions around recovery actually happen in evenings and weekends. Now, I can't tell you whether that happens across the rest of the prison estate in Scotland, but on the assumption that it does, if that amount of weekend activity is, if it's moved into focused daytime and the same amount of activity happens, it's just compressed during the week, then that might be a way of mitigating this. But if the result is that there is a less amount of activity being done, then it will inevitably affect people's well-being, and the impact is probably going to be seen around the higher tensions within the prison, which is probably going to result. It'll have unintended consequences, which I'm sure other panel members will have a better indication of what those will be.
Very grateful. Hayden Passy, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, I mean, very similar to what Hamish has shared. We are aware of the plans in response to the increased prison population, and we do know that there is greater need for appropriate staffing levels within the establishments across Scotland. We are in particular just now experiencing quite long waiting times to make appointments for people that we are due to meet with. In some establishments, we have waiting times of 3 weeks for appointments, of which there are 3 appointments available for all service providers, so people are fighting over those appointment spaces, which means that if we didn't successfully achieve one, we would be waiting a further 3 weeks. Now, we know how limited the time is to plan for somebody being liberated, and particularly, again, for the remand population. In many instances, we wouldn't have 3 weeks to wait to be able to see that person before they are due to be released. So there are significant staffing pressures that are putting a strain on our service provision and the impact that that has for the people that we're working with. Additionally, we are experiencing a lot of cancelled appointments on the day of the appointments, and in some instances, these are being recorded as refused appointments, which as a voluntary service has a detrimental impact where people may be perceiving that the individual does not want to come and work with a through care service. In actuality, it's been cancelled due to staffing issues, and that's not being recorded. So we do understand the need for improved staffing provision within the establishments, and we would advocate for that. However, we are concerned about any potential detrimental impact of the focus day model. At this stage, we don't have clear understandings of what that will mean in practice. We have been informed that 2 establishments already operate a focus day model. This has been maintained since the pandemic when they introduced this new staffing provision. However, we are still experiencing challenges around appointments, so we would hope that that would be improved. What we would be asking is for partner organisations to be consulted in the process of the focus day implementation so that we are able to ensure that it's not going to have a negative impact. And I think to the points previously made, would have concerns about that unproductive use of time for people when we know that engaging in meaningful activities, both delivered within the prison, but also access to visits with their family members and loved ones, which we know often happen after hours, i.e. after working hours, to allow families to be able to come and meet with people or on the weekends, so both to retain that access to potential children and their wider social support network. We would hope to see that improved, not as a consequence of the focus day model.
I'm very grateful. Convener.
We are aware that SBS has recently moved to a focus day, so we'll be looking for a wee bit more detail from them on that. Do you want to come in, Ben, and then I'll hand over to Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Thanks for your evidence so far. I just wanted to go back to the areas of questioning that were put earlier around Hayden Passy. You were talking very compellingly about the need to have good use of time within the prison estate. And there's been a lot of discussion across the panel about when people are released from custody and how are they supported in the community. I mean, to me, there's also an element here that feels worth emphasising today. I'd be interested in your reflections on it, in that while there's a need to fill people's time with effective utilisation towards recovery and well-being within custody and on release, there are also actors within the community and within the estate who are looking to fill that time differently for their own interests in order to, I'm talking about organised crime in particular, to get people addicted, to get people into debt, and to continue them on that pathway if they're already in that situation. It's just we haven't heard any reflections on that challenge today, and I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to add in that space.
Yeah, I would love to come in. I probably don't have a huge amount to add in terms of my knowledge of organised crime and the supply side of it, so I would probably be making an element of assumption and estimation, which might not help you.
Okay. Gillian Ray.
I suppose from talking about the community side and the Glasgow Alcohol and Drug Partnership is a very strong focus in working with Police Scotland and really, and also our local councillors regarding any sort of significant pockets of increase in crime or activity that gets brought to us. Then we do work together to try and tackle these issues. And I would say that with people that are using drugs and alcohol within the community, the focus is very much, as apart from the organised crime, the focus very much on the people that are using is about how we can get them into treatment together, as opposed to going down sort of criminal activity, and also highlighting if there is the police. We work in partnerships so that if there's any waves or trends or anything new, then we share that as a ADP to try and support the individuals involved in that. So it's I think for us it's a real partnership working round about any new or additional crime activities that's pertinent to alcohol and drug recovery services.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, I don't have much expertise on the wider systemic issues of organised crime groups, but I guess commenting on how that trickles down to families, people have talked about, you know, instances of being financially exploited or having to kind of, you know, react to their loved ones in prison having debt, and so the impact that has on the family is, you know, having to kind of pay for drug debts and not necessarily knowing where that's going. There's kind of a real, you know, unknown element to that, but they know that their loved one could be at risk, or they're being told that their loved one is at risk, and so then of course that creates more stress and anxiety, and it's, you know, exacerbated by the fact that family members just don't necessarily know what's going on the inside. So, you know, that, you know, hopefully shows a kind of real human impact of the kind of organised crime, you know, element to it. But I don't have much to say beyond that.
I guess I was just reflecting on that there are actors trying to pull people into addiction at the same time that you're trying to fill their time, or services are trying to fill their time with other activities and rehabilitation. I think that's just important for us to consider. Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Sharon Dowie.
Good morning. Going back onto the support offered in prison. So what support is currently offered to people who are in prison in terms of substance use for both drugs and alcohol? What role do peer support programmes, like peer mentors, recovery cafes, play in prisons? Is the support consistently available to everyone across the prison estate, and what do you think should be expanded? I don't know if I want to start with maybe Gillian in that one.
Again, I suppose the current services offered in prisons would come under Rhoda, the head of service, who's at the next committee meeting. So I suppose I'd probably pass over to Hayden.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. Although we are not directly involved in the delivery of peer programmes, we are rooted in relational practice, which I think is aligned with the approach from peer groups as well, in terms of building positive relationships. And certainly from a peer recovery aspect, the provision of experiences of those with lived and living experience is really important within that, and helps to build that trust and those genuine, authentic, credible relationships. We find that pro-modelling positive relationships is very important. And actually, coming back to the question from MSP Ben McPherson, my comment would be around the importance of those positive relationships to try and mitigate or prevent the harms from individuals who are seeking to encourage individuals into reoffending behaviours or offending behaviours in the first instance. So we do see really positive examples of peer recovery across prison establishments, and we are aware of services that do exist and operate within the different prisons. However, we find the challenge to be around the lack of consistency. So we work across 16 of the prison establishments, as we're focused on short-term and remand populations, and we see very different approaches as well as availability in terms of who can access, depending on whether they're sentenced on remand, in terms of availability. And often these types of programmes are considered optional, as a nice to have, as opposed to a critical component of supporting people with recovery, particularly when we know the prevalence of the need across the justice cohort. So we would be advocating for better availability and consistency. Our approach is to embed lived experience in all of the work that we are doing, and we encourage lived experience recruitment as well, to ensure that we have people who've previously experienced that support then delivering it. So we welcome the work that the recovery communities and cafes are doing across Scotland, and hope to see more of that and work with them in partnership.
More comments on why there's inconsistencies, because all the prison estate is now run by SPS. So I know we've heard quite a few times that there's issues with prisoners on remand. So I don't know if you could tell me a bit more about, if you've got any insight into what the inconsistencies are, and if you're aware of any work that's been done to try and address the issue with prisoners on remand.
We have extremely positive working relationships with SPS as a key partner in our through care service, and we have regular contact with them in response to any issues or challenges that we may experience. But what we find is often underpinning some of that inconsistency is that they do operate with independent governors, and decisions are made at a local level. And we've heard today about some of the staffing constraints as well, which we view as one of the critical factors in what drives whether programmes are able to run, whether they're delivered at that regular frequency, and the space issues that we heard as well today might limit the populations that can access. We do also know that there's challenges right now around risk management within the prison establishments. We are experiencing extremely high volumes of people being transferred across establishments, which is detrimental in a number of different ways for the people being supported and our through care provision. And we know some of that is about trying to better manage the risk within populations. So rather than people being held in the prison closest to them, they are sometimes being held, significant distances away, which also has a consequential impact on availability of family support. So we see that inconsistency sometimes driven by local decision making, and also the availability of resources to support that. Also, there's different organisations and providers that operate across those local communities, and we really welcome that place-based approach. But there are funding constraints across Scotland, which means that many brilliant services that would be providing that support are no longer able to do so, or they are having to pare back some of those programmes. An example would be that SACRO does part fund the reintroduction of Street Soccer Scotland's work within prisons, and they have a prison programme in place which we've been developing over the last year. However, they're only able to do that in certain establishments with certain populations at certain times, so they can't have a consistency of offering without the resources and funding to do so. So when there's a reliance on third sector organisations to provide that support, we welcome the opportunity to do so with our expertise, but we need appropriate funding to be able to do that. And we want to avoid people experiencing a postcode lottery or a prison lottery, depending on which one you go into. And what we do find is that the impact of those transfers means that it's another juncture where people are actually sometimes removed from the positive supports they've had. So they might be engaging in a programme in the establishment they came into, and then they're moved for a reason not always to do with themselves, but because of that management of cohorts, and they have a negative experience where that support's now taken away and they've lost that. And that also has impacts on access to healthcare appointments and many other things by being transferred across the country.
Okay, thank you. Mariana, have you any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hayden covered it very thoroughly. I mean, I think something, I suppose, going off of that is, the importance of the third sector workforce in delivering that kind of peer support and holistic support, and it's vital to staff and to resource prison staff and medical staff within prisons. But it's also, I think considering all of the plates, if you will, that they spin, all of the other issues that they have to deal with on a daily basis, something that came from discussion with families is wondering how practical that is to expect, prison staff to be able to deliver holistic and therapeutic support under all of those pressures, when we should really also focus on funding and resourcing third sector to be able to be embedded across the estate and provide that peer support consistently. So, I think that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you. Hamish, have you got any comments?
A couple of little bits to add in, which there is absolute inconsistencies across the estate, which is partly down to the things which we mentioned before. I have seen and agree with Hayden's assessment that because of the local governance within each prison, things are different, and that does pose a number of different challenges. There's also where things are funded on a local level, they are necessary because there are different needs in different places, so it's totally appropriate. The bit which we want to do, we should do more of and strive for, is that coordination of what's there. It's not necessarily an issue that there is inconsistencies, provided the services which are needed in the right prison are there at the right time. So inconsistency is not strictly necessary. It's important that there are the services that that prison needs at the right time. The bit which is necessary in order to do that correctly is appropriate join-up and also understanding what is going on and who is being referred where and for what. We were very fortunate in the data capture across New Routes was best in class, or we were told it was best in class by the partners we worked with. We were able to see and tell people which of it ended up being over 4,000 different organisations over 10 years where mentors assertively supported people to engage with, so we knew exactly what organisation, where and at what time a prisoner or then a prison leaver had been supported to access and what the outcome of that was. SPS and other national players are well placed to put in place measures to allow that sort of data to be captured nationally. So I'm not sure the issue is so much about whether there's consistencies or not. It's more about whether the right services are available in the right prison at the right time and whether there's overall visibility of who's been supported where.
Just if I could come back to Gillian Riley. The committee received a written submission from Glasgow ADP which mentioned healthcare teams are overwhelmed by an open referral system and caseloads that outweigh community service. I wonder if you could maybe tell us a wee bit more about the open referral system and how it's impacting in healthcare teams.
So the healthcare teams within the community, we currently have self-referral pathways into our alcohol and drug recovery services, and it's the demand which has increased on services and caseloads. And again, that's really across both alcohol and drug recovery services and mental health services. We have been working and going back to a point that was raised earlier regarding alcohol and drug recovery services and mental health and working together. And services in the sense people feel, and I've certainly heard that from reference groups before, in that you're not able to get treatment for mental health services if you're currently open to, well not open to, but actively taking alcohol or drugs. Certainly within Glasgow City, we have been working in partnership, and as part of my role is specialist mental health services and unscheduled care, along with alcohol and drug recovery services. So I'm very committed to bringing both mental health services and ADRS services together. We have developed a new way of working and a new implementation interface document, which looks at a model that manoeuvres through GP services, primary care services, supported by if there's addiction issues, and it's really what is the primary problem, what is the primary issue at the time. But other services can be brought in, and that includes mental health services. So service users can manoeuvre through different areas of service, and with that we hope to allow and to prevent the build-up of caseloads when you've got other services that you can bring in to specifically treat part of the condition that they're experiencing, whatever is priority. So that has been signed off, and will be going out to all our staffing level, all our staffing groups, and it's about ending that exclusion, and again taking on board from the Mental Welfare Commission about barriers to people accessing services if they have if they are or under the influence of drug and or alcohols, that we've made a commitment across Glasgow that should not prevent you from accessing services. So we have had commitment of Police Scotland, our acute colleagues in our emergency departments, our alcohol and drug recovery services, and our community mental health teams, and ensuring that there is 24-hour provision for someone that presents with both that are within that either currently using alcohol or drugs or in recovery, but also are presenting with a mental health problem. So for me, that in a way will be able to allow to move people into the most appropriate care that they need at that time, thus freeing up time to access other and assess other service users that are coming into services, both in alcohol and drug recovery services and in mental health services, because they're both really struggling with the current demand and capacity at present.
Said about 24-hour cover. Do you think we've got enough cover at weekends and in evenings?
So as part of within GG&C, so this is across Greater Glasgow and Clyde, we have the mental health assessment units, which are 24/7, and we have our crisis outreach alcohol and drug recovery service, which is 7 days, and they're actually based within the mental health assessment unit, because we do acknowledge that it's usually about I would say about 60 to 70% of people that come through services singularly have a mental health problem. So about 40%, 30 to 40% do have a combination of alcohol and drug history. So we actually, when we initiated the mental health assessment units, alcohol and drug recovery services were very much part of that. And during COVID, we actually, it was our day centre that helped staff that from the ADRS. So we had a lot of experience in alcohol and drug recovery within that crisis presentation. So we developed the crisis outreach service for ADRS was also implemented at that time, but they both were shown to be very successful in not only patients having direct care from emergency services. So rather than sitting in your accident and emergency for 5-6 hours before you see a doctor, whether that be because you're under the influence or and chaotic and experiencing self-harm thoughts, then that person can be brought down to the mental health assessment unit and be seen by registered nurses within 15 minutes, roughly, of arrival. Thus allowing police, ambulance, ED staff to move on and you know and manage the people that are also coming through, and likewise the patients that come through the service feel that it's a much quieter environment. There's not people, so they appreciate that they're not sitting in busy A&E departments. So we work very much together with the alcohol and drug recovery services. So during the night, we have the mental health assessment units. During the 7-day service for urgent follow-up, we have the crisis outreach service, which is the alcohol and drug recovery crisis team. We also have mental health crisis services, which work 7 days a week, that are also linked into the mental health assessment unit, and that covers GG&C and obviously the 4 emergency departments within GG&C. So therefore, overnight, we will always have a service that we can refer to the next day, whether that be a public holiday, Saturday, Sunday, or a Tuesday afternoon. We always have, whether it be the alcohol and drug recovery, their own care team. If not, we will always have a community service that can go out and actively follow someone up until their main care team is back online on a Monday or after a bank holiday. So I do think we do have that. That was a long-winded answer.
I'll pass back to the convener. Thank you for that.
I was a way to pull us back into the prison estate, but no, that's very interesting to hear. I do have, I think Ben McPherson and Pauline were maybe looking to come in with a couple of supplementaries. Ben, are you still?
If there's
Yep,
time, yeah.
and then I'll hand over to
Thanks.
Pauline, and then I'll bring in Rona McCann.
I was just really interested to hear the reflections about the importance of the third sector and what was said about how having differentiated services available for different places was actually appropriate. But it seemed to me that what was highlighted in that discussion around the importance of the third sector was that there's, in terms of creating that joined upness was the phrase that you used, resourcing and sustainability of funding was perhaps an issue, and we're very committed in across the Parliament to a preventative approach to numerous issues, including trying to reduce offending and reoffending. But I mean, how impactful do you think an additional allocation of resource on a sustainable basis for the third sector could be in these challenges that we're considering today? I don't know. Hayden Passy, you talked about it, and Hamish Roberts in particular, but go ahead, Hamish.
Yeah, I guess the obvious answer is the third sector would welcome any additional funding which is there, but that's probably more of a trite response than you're looking for. I think what that would look like and what resource it is and where it's targeted is absolutely the questions to be asking. The biggest challenge that I see working within this sector and through, like, for example, being involved in the Criminal Justice Voluntary Sector Forum, where there's a kind of a group of third sector organisations that work in this space, and in general, short-term funding wastes a lot of money. So you do not get, as public servants, the decisions you're making, you do not get the biggest bang for your buck where money is offered on a short-term basis, because they lose all the economies of scale around start-up of a service. If something has got 1 year of funding, you spend 10% of your budget setting it up, and then you spend 10% of your budget shutting it down, and if it runs for 12 months, you've got staff who are coming in who are broadly less effective in their first 3 or 4 months of the job, and then in the final 2 or 3 months of their job, they're worrying whether they've got a job. So actually, this is not always the case, but is often the case. You actually don't need as much money in the system if you spend it over a longer period of time, because you generate a substantial amount of savings, efficiency, optimisation, better quality working. If you can say you've got this for 5 years, this is going to happen for 3 years, it's going to happen for 5 years, much better outcomes.
Spend and the difference it can make in terms of savings in the criminal justice system more widely. Hayden Passy, you want to come in as well on this?
Thank you. Yes, I would agree with what Hamish has reflected, and we've experienced that over the previous 13 years of through care delivery, where both Shine and New Routes were subject to annual funding, and we experienced the challenges that brought, that Hamish has reflected, and in particular for our staff cohort. So for Upside, the new National Voluntary Through Care Service funded by Scottish Government, we welcomed that is funded in principle for 3 years, and we did have an uplift in budget from what was previously in place for Shine and New Routes. However, what I would reflect is that the scope of the new service provision is greater, in that we are working with males on remand, and we are also offering support for up to 12 months, which was the recommendations by Community Justice Scotland and Scottish Government. And what we know is that the budget that is available for through care support is not enough to reach the total eligible population. So we have an annual budget of 5.3 million, and I think some work that Community Justice Scotland conducted evidenced the need for over 19 million per annum to support that population. So my comment would more be around where you want to target that additional resource. So we know that we need more money to reach all of the people who need the support. As I say, remand is extremely challenging, and we don't have sufficient time to plan for those releases. People are not prepared for that release themselves, and we see the impact that has on them. And what I think we've experienced over the years is a churn of individuals who unfortunately are going in and out of the system, and that's not positive for anybody. So we would really welcome better kind of targeted efforts to reduce the remand population in and of itself, but also that holistic support for people to wrap around, and as you reflected, a preventative approach, so a prevention strategy to avoid individuals needing to come into custody in the first place. But we would welcome any additional resources to support the third sector to be able to increase the high quality support that they're seeking to provide for individuals all across the country.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I've got Pauline McNeill with a supplementary, and then I'll bring in Rona Mackay.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about plans for the new Barlinnie prison, which are much further away than everybody would like, but eventually we will have a prison that is planned for higher capacity than the current Barlinnie, is my understanding, because I've asked some questions about it. And I wondered if you'd given any thought, or is it too early? Because, I mean, for a start, you'd like to think that that would help reduce overcrowding overall. May not, but would give third sector organisations, which are obviously the backbone of all of this, a chance to think about a different way, or not a different way, but a different, I suppose, better way of actually dealing with the drug problem in prisons when there's more space and the staff are able to concentrate a bit more on how they can assist prisoners rather than what they're doing right now, which is just daily pressures on overcrowding and trying to keep, for not to put a fine point, and make sure there isn't violence erupting because of the conditions that prisoners are being held in some cases. Just wondered if you'd had given any thought to that sort of future.
So I would be happy to comment on that. We've had recent meetings with regards to the new HMP Glasgow and also HMP Highland, which will replace HMP Inverness, because we're very keen to be involved in the planning. We currently have 2 dedicated full-time staff members in HMP Barlinnie. In most other establishments, we have either one or a part-time worker to cover multiple establishments. So we have increased resource in Barlinnie due to the capacity. From the conversations we've had, we had confirmation that the capacity of HMP Glasgow is the same as HMP Barlinnie in terms of the number of people who will be held in that establishment. The space of the prison itself may be different, but as of last week, that was the advice we were provided. That the number of prisoners, so the capacity for people held in the establishment in HMP Glasgow, we were advised would be the same as HMP Barlinnie. We are aware that the population of HMP Highland will be double that of HMP Inverness. So we're looking at...
Can I just say the figures that we've got from memory? So currently it's 900, I think, is it, capacity?
I don't have those to hand.
And I think in answer, I would expect in that figure to be nearer 1,300.
I couldn't comment on it. It could be that the official capacity of HMP Barlinnie is closer to the 900, but the current capacity with the increased use of doubled cells and means that it's actually sitting at a higher capacity, which will mirror what the new establishment, which should be built to support those individuals. Yeah. So, but that's what we're aware of, is the capacity itself is the same as what it is currently for the number of people in Barlinnie, but HMP Highland will be double what HMP Inverness is just now, so that does have a direct impact on us from a capacity point of view, as we'll need to support that population, and that will have impacts in terms of our staffing. What I would say is that we welcomed the introduction of HMP Stirling, which took a trauma-informed therapeutic approach to establishments, mirrored by the community custody units, although the original recommendation was for 5 community custody units, and as far as we're aware, there are currently only 2, and we're not aware of plans for the further 3. So that does limit the ability for that to have the effects it was intended to around keeping people in their communities and having access to their own local communities, rather than having to travel. But we would welcome the HMP Glasgow and Highland adopting a similar approach to HMP Stirling, which has a more therapeutic environment and enables better supports for people while they're there and better use of time, which should hopefully prevent increased risk of harm.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll bring in Rona Mackay and then Katie Clark.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Yes, I wanted to ask about recent research that's shown that women have different sort of pathways into substance abuse than men, and many women, as we know, are victims of domestic abuse, and that's you know, led to their dependency. Can you sort of outline to me, are there different ways of treating women and giving them support in prison for their addiction issues? And is it sufficient? And in what way does that differ from what men receive? Anybody want to answer? Hayden, you want to go first?
But also,
Yeah.
if others
Sure.
would like to come in. My experience would be more predominantly from our past delivery of the Shine Women's Mentoring Service, which supported women in the justice system for 13 years. So we are in the very, very early stages of Upside as a national service, and we do work across all genders and cohorts, but we don't yet have those established learnings around trends and insights. So speaking from Shine specifically, we're acutely aware of the prevalence of trauma for women that are in the justice system, particularly experiences of domestic abuse, and there is evidence around the prevalence of head injuries that women have experienced, as well as the complex mental health needs that I mentioned earlier, the complexity of that support that's required, and that exemplifies the vulnerabilities of women. As I mentioned just there, we welcomed HMP Stirling and the CCUs as trauma-informed environments, and we're hopeful that there will be more approaches to support that. So I guess our experience is that women do have different needs in terms of how support responds to their experiences of trauma, and often that many of the women who are in prison establishments are also victims of offences. So we would really welcome that gendered specialist approach to supporting women and the availability of specialist services to support them.
Come in on that. So are you saying they're not there at the moment?
I would say that from a through care perspective, we feel very positively that we have retained the staff who were involved in the Shine Women's Mentoring Service. That means that even though we are now working on a national level, we retain that specialism around their needs and what we have learned over the last 13 years about the different experiences of women coming into prison and how that impacts them. Also their experiences as often the primary caregiver and being separated from their children. So we do have a specialism there, and there are specialist services in the communities, but we would be looking for those to be better joined up and more readily available to have that approach to women and a better training and understanding of women's experiences in terms of the stigma and discrimination that they face as people in the justice system, and also that with HMP Stirling specifically, because that's an admissions prison, and I've mentioned earlier the volume of transfers, we are hearing that it can be quite destabilising for women. They're coming into an environment like Stirling, which offers a different space, and then they are being moved into other prisons. And as we've heard from many colleagues, that transfer experience is another destabilising juncture, so that can actually increase the risk of harm and vulnerability for those women, which could be a contributing factor in some of the coping mechanisms that we've heard are required to respond to trauma.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that specifically? Gillian?
Just to highlight that when I spoke earlier about having access to prison services and space, one of the areas that we do have the recovery community going into is the women's prison, the new women's prison. I think it's Lily. And that certainly seems to be working well. And in general, in talking about additional funding for third sector, etc., I do think women's services in general, we do have tomorrow's women within the justice system. But what we do know and acknowledge is we have about a 70-30% split across alcohol and drug recovery services on male and females accessing, and my colleague is absolutely right. There's different pathways into recovery, and it is about the specific supports that women need to make it through recovery. And seeing the recovery communities, they are very well supported by females that have actually made that journey. So there is a gap there. Yes, absolutely.
We talked earlier about the overlap or lack of overlap between mental support and addiction support. So does that come together more for women, do you think, given the trauma that most of them have experienced?
Yeah, and I think that's certainly what we're looking at. We're looking at specifically within Glasgow, women that are really difficult to engage, that are really complex. And we are looking to build that within our access to emergency mental health care as well, to ensure that there is a pathway there, that if women are coming in, then we can build a suite of services around them and make sure that they have access, because we do recognise there is a lot of trauma. There's maybe a lot of self-harm and also as well, one of the issues with women accessing is childcare facilities. You know, it really puts a barrier up, and our recovery cafes are just, you know, I've been to several of them, and they're quite amazing and uplifting. And there's kids everywhere, you know, and
I've
you know,
been to one in Low Moss, they have the same family setting.
Yeah. So I think if we were, I would really like to see us making a change in those percentages, because they're right across access to alcohol and drug recovery services.
Thanks, that's interesting. Hamish, did you?
Yeah, add a little bit. There's absolutely a need within the women cohort to have slightly different support for people. Women need safe women-only spaces in a lot of cases. There is, as you've rightly pointed out, and others on the panel have pointed out, women are generally the primary caregiver in many cases. So when they're incarcerated, there is a significant impact on families. The bit that I would point out, in addition to that, is that every cohort has different needs, and in some times, gender-specific definitions do not ultimately serve us that well, because there are some men who have the same needs as some women, in the same way that there are some women who have different needs to other women. So it's actually more effective, and I think the outcomes generally are shown to be better where services and systems are designed to be purposefully adaptable to the individual presenting needs of the human in front of you, rather than pre-designed because of we're expecting that person to be a man or a woman or whatever. So it's actually slightly better to design models which can flex in flight and therefore be emergent to the changing needs of a complex cohort.
Given the high proportion of women who are victims of domestic abuse or trauma, I think it's important that they are recognised, as Gillian has pointed out. There is a definite need there, I think, for that. Sorry, Mariana, did you want to come in?
No,
You're okay.
I don't.
That's fine. Thank you, convener.
We are just about to come up to time, but there's a few more issues that I'm quite keen for the committee to be able to just cover. So if the panel's okay just to hang back maybe another 5 to 10 minutes, that would be really helpful for us. So with that, I'll bring in Katie Clark.
Thank you very much. And I also was going to ask about women, and can I maybe just ask you, given everything that you've said, is it fair to say that the new prison at Stirling and the 2 new women's custody units have put a lot more focus on these issues, and the fact that their new facilities has been a positive, so that, if you like, the direction of travel has been a positive one? Is that fair to say from what you've said already?
Yes, I would agree. I think we have seen very positive evidence from the introduction of the community custody units. It took time. So initially, I think they were operating below capacity because there is an assessment process that needs to be completed to identify who is suitable and eligible to be in a community custody unit. And certainly towards the end of our time delivering Shine specifically, they were operating much greater capacity, and we were seeing really positive outcomes. You know, attending events in the community where women were able to come and share their experiences and contribute in programmes around employability, education, greater access to services. So yes, the focus on trauma-informed, custom-built environments like HMP Stirling and the CCUs have been very positive. And I think to Hamish's point about actually being able to respond to individuals and provide person-centred care, we would welcome seeing those types of environments across the whole of Scotland to be able to better support men and women.
That, and following on from that, we earlier on in the morning were talking about meaningful activities, and the impression I get is that it's not quite a postcode lottery, but there's a very variable picture in different parts of Scotland, because obviously the pressures in different prisons are very different. The overcrowding in some prisons is far more extreme than others. During COVID, obviously, you know, in general, prisoners weren't allowed out their cells. Often the impression I get from speaking with families of prisoners and prisoners is that the picture now is very variable in terms of what's happening in prisons. Is that a fair comment in terms of your experience, that there isn't in any way a uniform picture, and there's pockets of good practice, perhaps such as Stirling and the 2 women's custody units, and no doubt many other places? Is that a fair comment in terms of this issue?
Yes, we see brilliant pockets of best practice all across the establishments for different reasons. And one of the roles that we have, or we feel is an opportunity for Upside as a national service working across those establishments, is to try and identify those best practices and share that learning. And we do a lot of advocating and influencing and championing for that. So yes, I would agree that there's different experiences that people have when they're in different establishments. And as I've mentioned throughout, the transfers are indicative of that, because if someone's only in one establishment and hasn't been into custody before, they don't know how things operate elsewhere. But actually, when they're moved, they have such a varied experience. And for us, having staff based in all prisons, and then we come together as a collective regularly to reflect, we are able to hear and evidence those differences. We bring SPS into those meetings with our staff team, our prison staff team, and they're part of that, which means they hear the learnings directly, and we use those to create positive change. They also sit on our new strategic action group for wider systemic change, and we also take the learnings from our lived experience forums directly to SPS and Scottish Government as our funder. So we do our best to advocate for better consistency and the learnings of good practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I can come in with a question on MAT standards. So obviously throughout our inquiry we've discussed MAT standards in this context of the prison estate. I'm interested in the view of panel members with regard to how well are MAT standards being implemented in prisons, and do you have a view on whether or not it's likely that the Scottish Prison Service will meet its anticipated implementation date of, I think it's April next year, and perhaps if not, what are the barriers that are being faced with regard to that? So I'll bring in Gillian first. Thank you.
Yes, I suppose just firstly to say that the MAT standards have been fully implemented within the community. We did receive additional support and funding to implement that, which was, that was able to provide us with the project management to be able to deliver. The prisons in custody have not had that additional funding. So currently there is an implementation group with the MAT standards within prisons. They are all sitting at amber just now, so there is work going on to achieve them. There is one which is in MAT Standard 8, which is currently green, and that's for access to advocacy and welfare rights, which is very well provided within the prison services. But I would defer any further detail round about each individual MAT standards to my colleague that will be presenting at the next one, as that's what she would be covering.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Anyone else want to come in at all? No, on that? No? Okay. I'll maybe bring in Fulton McGregor for a question.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. It's been a really interesting session today. One of the things that came through in our call for views was that one of the biggest challenges, and I think we've heard this in the Justice Committee several times, was is upon release the availability and access to housing. And of course that includes people going back to their previous environment and peers. I used to previously work as a criminal justice social worker before becoming an MSP, and this is a really, really big issue. The people that are coming out of prison, they're continually going back to the places where the places and people that got them into trouble in the first place. So can I ask how can these barriers be dealt with, these barriers and challenges be dealt with, and do you think there's more that needs to be done around that? And specifically looking at housing, can you talk about the SHORE standards and how you believe they're currently working in practice? And because you're nodding, Hayden, I'll come you first. So don't nod.
I'll
is the
remember
key.
not to nod now. I've learned my lesson. I think I was just agreeing with your reflections around the challenges with housing and the impact that that has for people on release, and that's certainly something that we have experienced over a number of years and continue to see, particularly with the housing crisis across Scotland and the increased number of local authorities that are facing those challenges with a shortage of supply. And linked to that would be our strong recommendation for better pre-release planning, specifically to address housing as one of those key factors, as we know that for individuals, having a safe and suitable house to return to is an extreme protective factor in their recovery and resettlement and reintegration into their community. So we would really advocate for a better provision of housing. In terms of some of those barriers specifically, one of the things that we see as a through care provider is that we again have a big advocacy role in that people don't know their rights. So even though the Shore standards exist, people aren't informed about those and don't know what it means for them in plain language that they can understand and feel able to advocate for their own rights within that. In particular, again, drawing on our experience from the Shine service with women who were often being returned to housing where they were at increased risk, whether that's from risk of a previous partner who posed challenges or being placed in unsuitable accommodation far from their support network and children, and that caused increased harms for them. So we would really be wanting to advocate for people being better informed about their rights so that they can challenge when they do not experience the appropriate care that they should. We welcome the Ask and Act duty, which will mean that people who are returning to communities are able to go to another local authority area and should have appropriate provision of housing. But we know that often people's support network is in their own community, and that can also bring challenges. And the fact that many local authority areas are experiencing a shortage means that even though the Shore standards exist, there is a lack of supply to be able to actually help people to have the housing that they require. So the inconsistencies of what is available is an extreme challenge, and also that lack of knowledge about what the Shore standards mean in practice. We do our best as a service provider to support individuals to navigate the real challenges when accessing housing. I will say that in one local authority area, there are over 67, I believe it is now, housing associations, each with individual application processes. So you can imagine for someone coming out of custody with many practical matters to address on the day of release, as well as the emotional challenges, trying to navigate 67 different housing applications is impossible, and our staff tend to be the ones to support them to do that. But from a resourcing perspective for us, that's challenging. I had one colleague, I think last week, make over 100 calls to the housing provider to try and get an answer on the phone for someone who was actually supposed to be returning to a tenancy, but they weren't provided with any keys or fob to access that, and ultimately would have to breach their order in order to be able to get access to housing. So it's not straightforward, but something as simple as having a telephone number for housing makes a huge difference, whereas currently we have just email addresses and there are no responses. So we would welcome some practical things to address that, as well as hopefully better availability of housing and increased understanding of people's rights to access that.
Thanks. Yeah. Hamish?
I think, again, for context for the panel, it's around 84% of people who leave custody have a need for accommodation support. That's actually across the whole of Scotland. This is an issue, but it actually is about 30% higher for people leaving custody. And also the issues are slightly more acute, as we've just heard from Hayden. I could give you an example of something where a bit of best practice which did work quite successfully. So out of Barlinnie, up till, it may still be happening, but up till March, there was a project that ran with the HMP, well, the Barlinnie Through Care Group, in combination with New Routes and the Glasgow Homeless team, which essentially created a pathway for housing directly out of prison. So it was for anybody who was being, every short-term prisoner was being released from Barlinnie, returning to Glasgow, was a process was put in place to ensure that, number one, they were on the caseload of the housing team, number two, they were on the New Routes caseload, and number three, they were met at the gate by New Routes mentor on Day of Liberation, either to take them to the housing office if necessary, or where a tenancy had been secured, to take them directly to that tenancy. And a simple example like that is something which cost practically zero extra money, but just joined up the three parts of the system that needed to be joined up at that source. Granted, there are challenges with housing stock across the country. So in Fife, for example, where we did a bit of work out of HMP Perth, with people going back to Fife, the challenge in Fife is that there is next to no available housing stock. So no amount of coordination can envisage a house out of thin air, but at least there is examples of where really good coordination happens. And back to that kind of research piece we did 18 months ago, the bit that came out of that was the need to coordinate housing at the point where you're coming out of custody and there is a through care situation in place. Then actually housing should be built into that through care model at that point rather than being as an add-on, because housing is, as I said before, housing, mental well-being and substance are the three biggest issues. And if you get housing wrong, then you spend the rest of your time playing catch-up with somebody on release.
Much. Mariana, I don't know if you want to come in. Just, I know we're just slightly short of time, but just from your organisation's perspective, if there's any comments that you would like to make just on the specific issue around release and the sort of challenges that people face.
Yeah, I can't speak specifically to housing or the shore standards, but I know that for families similar to what they experience when their loved ones are discharged from hospital in the community, if there's maybe kind of not thorough planning or kind of unexpected release or changes around that, families are in situations, especially in the community, often the first port of call to go to their loved one and make sure that they're safe. But the issue with prison is often that people in prison upon release are quite far away from their families, especially if their families are in rural or remote areas. Family members might be elderly or have mobility issues. They might not drive. So if there's not that planning in place, that can cause a lot of stress for families who aren't able to go and, kind of care for their family member when they come out of prison. And because of that, maybe their loved one, I was having a discussion with a staff member around how, cases where family members aren't there to make sure their loved one is safe, and so their loved one has to stay elsewhere, and so they don't know exactly what that loved one can do. They can be put in kind of difficult or dangerous situations, but there's something about the importance of involving families, including families in those discussions around release consistently, and making sure those unexpected changes don't impact families, especially elderly people or young people who might not have as much of a choice on how they help their loved one.
Thank you for that. I think it just highlights the actual physical, practical challenges of the release process itself, which you've helpfully highlighted. So thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to draw this session to a close. I'm just going to ask panel members if there's any final comments that you want to make. There's always lots that we don't have time to cover, but if not, then can I thank you very much for your attendance today. Lots for us to think about, and as we sort of begin to shape our report. So I'm going to thank you and suspend this meeting for 5 minutes to allow for a changeover of panels. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, members. So we'll move on to our second panel of the morning, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr Craig Sayers, Clinical Lead, Prison Healthcare, NHS Forth Valley and National Prison Care Network. Dr Leslie Graham, retired public health doctor and founding member of Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems, and Dr Katrina Connell from the University of Stirling. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you also to witnesses who have provided written submissions. So again, looking to spend around about 80 minutes for this session, and I wonder if I can get things going with my usual sort of opening question, and I'll maybe come to Dr Sayers first, and then I'll move across to Dr Graham and Dr Connell. So throughout this inquiry, we've been keenly aware that we've heard a lot of evidence, and probably the primary focus of our evidence has been with regard to the use of drugs in prisons, and less so with regard to the use of alcohol and some of the other complex issues around codependency and use of alcohol and its impact, particularly in the justice system. So I wonder if you could perhaps set the scene by sort of setting out if illicit alcohol in prisons is indeed an issue in Scotland. Is there adequate and consistent screening and early identification of alcohol use disorders at admission? And what support and service provision is then available in prisons, but more broadly in the community? So it's quite a big question, but I'll bring in Dr Sayers to kick things off.
Thank you. Yes, so my main remit is working within the prison, so I'm probably better placed to talk about that side of things. In terms of illicit alcohol use in prison, it's not really a problem. You know, we have the odd Christmas hooch brewed, but as a rule of thumb, it's very few and far between. It isn't something that causes massive problems in terms of patients collapsing. So it's not never, but it certainly isn't a big problem. The issues more where we face in terms of alcohol are about the admission process. That's where we will see acute withdrawals. So if patients are alcohol dependent, as a doctor in the community, you would never advise that patient to suddenly stop drinking. There is work with that patient to taper that down. In terms of somebody being arrested, there is immediate loss of access to alcohol. So we often will see by the time patients have spent a weekend or an overnight in police and gone through court, by the time they arrive at prison, they may be demonstrating acute physical problems. If you'll indulge me, I'll just speak a little bit about the National Prison Care Network. We know about alcohol, but to try and get some sort of harder data on where we are and where we would like to be. At the request of Scottish Government in 2023, the start of 2023, the network were asked to develop a target operating model, or a TOM as we call it. And the target operating model, none of us had ever heard of, if I'm being honest. So we researched what that was. And the aim of a TOM really is to outline where you are just now, what the future state we would like to achieve is, and what's going to be need to deliver that vision. So when we looked at lots of recommendations, and there are countless publications from Scottish Government, Fatal Accident Inquiry Determinations, HMIPS, Mental Welfare Commission, there's over 500 recommendations for prisons to adjust how they care for patients, and under a number of themes. And at a time when prisons are really struggling in terms of population numbers, staff recruitment and retention, it's just unrealistic to look at 500 potential recommendations. So what the team did for the target operating model, we gathered 52 subject matter experts, had 14 focus groups with prisoners throughout the prison estate across 6 prisons, with a whole variety of male, female, young offenders, excuse me, short-term, long-term, top-end prisoners, to get a real feedback as to where we are and what are the key themes that need to be changed. And over 90 change ideas were generated from these meetings. And by involving these key stakeholders, we got a top 20. And within these top 20, alcohol and drugs were identified as the areas of greatest need and greatest change. So if I look at specifically the future state that we're aspiring to within the prisons for alcohol, the points that we came up with, we were looking to deliver in all prisons, is that we were looking to ensure that there were approved assessment tools to objectively assess for alcohol withdrawals at the point of arrival into custody, to determine the need to start detox medications, and to make sure that these assessment tools and treatment are implemented by all prisons. The use of screening tools, so there's FAST, the Fast Alcohol Screening Tool, and Audit, the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, to be done as soon as practical on admission or immediately afterwards to identify those that need, those with problem alcohol dependency. Work with partners within the prisons to deliver alcohol brief interventions, identify people with primary alcohol dependency as opposed to codependency, make sure that there are services available to provide appropriate psychosocial interventions, provide appropriate pharmacological interventions, and provision of evidence-based treatments to be introduced for liberation, such as Campril or Antabuse. So these were the key points in relation to alcohol specifically we are looking for prisons to deliver. And amongst many other of these 20 key recommendations, we have over 100 sort of key points that we want prisons to benchmark themselves against. So after a year of developing the TOM and getting agreement and draft processes through, each prison was asked to benchmark itself against those criteria for their prisons and alcohol service delivery. And there are 9 board areas with prisons, and at that point in April 24, 100% of these services were being delivered in 4 board areas, 83% in one, 67% in another board area, 50% in 2 board areas, and only 17% of those targets in 1 board area. So we had an objective picture of where we were across the prison estate with regards to alcohol. Every 6 months, we use this target operating model. We use national groups to try and share best practice for areas that are struggling, the 17% area, provide advice and support from areas with 100% saying this works for us, maybe you want to try this. And every 6 months, prisons re-benchmark themselves against all the criteria within the target operating model. And the latest data back was from April of this year, so 12 months on. And at this point, in regards to those alcohol-specific targets, we now have 5 boards delivering 100% of them, 2 boards 83% and 2 boards 50%. So we can see there is an improvement, and the expectation and the purpose of the TOM is to ensure that all boards are delivering 100% of those targets. And deficiencies, the National Care Network is a strategic network. Boards do not answer to us, so we provide best practice and recommendations, but it's not our role to monitor those boards. That's really done through HMP inspectorate visits and also fatal accident inquiry recommendations. So that's the position of where prisons are, what we're looking to deliver. So we're getting there in over the half board areas, those key assessments on admission, delivery of appropriate treatment is there, the ongoing support and social interventions and medication and release is there, but there are still a few board areas who need to get up to full capacity.
Thank you very much. Really helpful opening remarks. So what I think you're saying is it's not so much the sort of illicit use of alcohol, so to speak, in prisons. The focus needs to be on the management of individuals impacted by alcohol use, effective interventions and support while they're in prison, and presumably in terms of post-release as well. Yes, right. And the TOM is supporting sort of that delivery, if you like.
Yes.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, thank you. Lots for us to think about. Leslie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. We do hear less about alcohol use in prison because for much of the time it's out of sight. I mean, there is some limited, as Craig said, illicit alcohol use in prison. The Scottish Prison Survey says that 17% of prisoners report having used illicit alcohol whilst in prison, but it doesn't say how often and it doesn't say how much. So it's really, the trouble is it is out of sight. It's not in front of everyone's face as drug use is. So there's a risk that it is somehow forgotten. The service provision is there, as well as the TOM, which Craig has outlined, and His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, which standard 9.7 looks specifically at alcohol services. There is also other monitoring of what's being delivered in terms of alcohol services, which is the drug and alcohol waiting times by Public Health Scotland. And that does show a slightly sort of maybe concerning picture in that, for example, from 23 to 24, there were 187 referrals to alcohol specialist services in prisons in Scotland. And if we think around 15,000 or so prisoners, individuals per year, and that 1/3 of those, 31% we know, will be alcohol dependent. So there does appear to be, to me, a treatment gap issue there. We also have data gaps. I mean, in terms of, that's just one aspect of it, but do we know if screening is being delivered? We were counting the delivery of alcohol brief interventions, but that ceased in 2021, and that was Public Health Scotland. And then also the transparent governance and accountability. So we have got some systems in place, but TOM is a self-report. HMIPS will go around each individual prison, so it's not a sort of real-time monitoring of it. So I think these are some of the issues which I think we need to consider when thinking about alcohol problems of those coming into the prison setting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And certainly waiting times is something that came up in the previous panel as a challenge, and presumably that's made slightly more acute at the moment because of the sort of pressures on the prison estate with regard to the population, I would think, but we'll probably come back to that. OK, I'll bring in Katrina Connell.
Hi there, morning. Thank you for inviting me along today. So I'm a health researcher, and I predominantly look at the health of people in contact with the criminal justice system, but more on the journey out of prison and when supervised in the community. So I will do my best to contribute in that part particularly. So in relation to alcohol use in prison, I can't speak specifically to that, but one of the challenges I think that both Craig and Leslie have alluded to is that knowing exactly how many people within custody and who they are can limit our ability to provide services. And it's exciting to hear that screening is happening and improving and increasing all the time to be able to do that. I think the last Scottish study that was published in 2011, so that's quite some time ago, by a colleague of mine, made the estimate that around 73% of people admitted to just one prison had alcohol problems, so 3/4 of the prison population having a problem with their alcohol use. And obviously the vast majority of them, almost all of them, will be released back into the community, where the availability of services is the same as it would be for you or I in terms of accessing services. So it would be general community drug and alcohol services that people would access. So we've done a little bit of work, and I haven't been able to share publicly because our work's still being peer-reviewed, but I think it is available to committee members around access to services on release, particularly for substance use, but not narrowing down just on alcohol. But what we did was look at the reasons people had contact with services in their run-up to imprisonment, and we found that about 1/3 of people in custody had previously had contact with alcohol and drug services, and the vast majority of them had alcohol use recorded. So whether or not that was a problematic use is unclear, but everybody who is known to services had that recognised. So I think, just echoing what Leslie said there, it's important not to lose that alcohol is there, even though substances, as in drugs, may be presenting as more urgent. That is often in the background, and I suppose services practitioners need to have the skill set and the awareness to address both. Even if it looks like in prison people are not drinking, that problem hasn't necessarily gone away. And so we see that in contact with services on release, which are much higher amongst people who've been in custody compared to similar people who haven't. I think I think in terms of available support in the community, that's probably all I'd say at this point. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. No, that's really helpful. I'm going to bring in Pauline McNeill in a second, but I wonder if I can maybe just come back to yourself, Craig, just in relation to your sort of opening remarks with regard to the TOM and sort of monitoring of delivery against it. We've received quite significant evidence from the Scottish Recovery Consortium with regard to this inquiry, and they certainly set out in their evidence, if you like, commentary with regard to alcohol harm as well as drug harm. And if I can just maybe highlight one of the recommendations that they've made, which would be around alcohol use and treatment gaps. If I just read out the recommendation for a rapid review of alcohol services, which was also something that they referenced, is particularly relevant given the high prevalence of alcohol-related harm in prison populations. The committee's inquiry into substance misuse should consider alcohol alongside illicit drugs when assessing treatment capacity and service design. So it was really just in the context of what's already happening, if there's anything that you would care to sort of maybe say in response to that.
Yeah, so in terms of, as we say, when we did the key stakeholders, the experts in the field, alcohol was not pushed aside. It was there along with drugs as part of the strategy for the future state. In terms of, I think the danger is missing the patients when they're in. We do, I believe, deal with them well on admission. We have the assessment tools to identify the acute need. Delirium tremens, which is severe alcohol withdrawals, still has a significant 20% mortality, and there hasn't been an alcohol death on admission. So that initial high-risk period, I think we deal with well. Yeah. There are now treatments for liberation, and that's improving. I know it's not probably across the board for all areas. That might be one of the deficiencies, but as we see those percentages increasing, I think most areas now are providing that. The interventions and support during the other period, to the time of the sentence, that's the key area, because ultimately alcohol's not being used by our patient group in the same way as drugs. It's not being used for fun. It's a coping strategy. Yeah. And if that's somebody's coping strategy outside to cover down their traumas, when that alcohol's not available, those traumas are there and they need dealing with. It's making sure, particularly with the population pressures, we are aware of patients in admitting jails who are acutely unwell. We do the initial treatment. We maybe have them on the caseload. But due to the population demands, there is a lot of movement around the prison estate. And it's very feasible that people will move from one establishment to another. And at the point of arrival, they're not unwell. They're fine. And if they don't raise their hand as needing help, it's feasible some of these patients will go under the radar. Drug misuse continues at a far higher level within prisons, and we're often daily running to patients under the influence of substances, and we're picking them up as we go along. So my concern would be, from an alcohol perspective, the key future state things that we want to be there, and maybe they're in most health boards and most prisons, just making sure that people don't fall through the cracks and all of the services are there. We don't miss them.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, I'll bring in Pauline McNeill for a follow-up question on that point that we've been looking at, and then I'll bring in Liam Kerr.
Thank you. Good morning. I think, Dr. Leslie Graham, you're absolutely right that a lot of the discussion about prisons management has been about drugs, and I think it's really important that you're here to talk about the prevalence and issues around management of those dependent on alcohol. So the committee have been trying to learn a bit more about how prisons run and how drugs get into prison. So we know a lot more now, but I just wondered if you wanted to comment on how that's happening. Is it a different way? We know that drones are used for drugs, but I think the general public are always mystified. You think it's easy. Why can't we just stop drugs now? And we realise it's a really difficult thing, because the comings and goings of the prison service kitchens, for example. I mean, the deliveries, and now with the advent of drones, it makes the job of the prison service much harder. So I just wanted to get your views on that.
Well, I actually did work in the Scottish Prison Service for a couple of years, and I had the similar question: how come drugs are getting in? They're much smaller. I mean, it's not like a bottle of vodka or anything like that. But there are ways and means. And actually, when I was working at the Scottish Prison Service, I wanted to try and introduce a supply of books from publishers when they were getting them. And then we were just on the verge of getting a constant supply, because I was actually just reading the inspectorate report of Barlini, and that was, we're talking about, you know, purposeful activity and so on. And so here was a constant supply of books, but that was just at the point when drugs were coming in on paper. So there was that risk assessment was thought to be too much at that time. So I mean, I think there's as in the community, there's not only the difference in the kind of drugs that are coming in, increasingly powerful. We see that out on the streets. We've just had the drug-related death report figures yesterday for Scotland. Thankfully, 13% down compared to last year, but still the highest in Europe. So there's just various different ways in which drugs, because they're much smaller, can be concealed, can get in, whether it's the prisoners, whether it's visitors, whether it's members of staff, whether it's drones, etc., etc. It is really hard, I think, really hard. And if the demand is there, and this is the previous session was talking about, lack of purposeful activity, boredom, stress, mental health, and so on, then, you know, where there's a demand, there will probably be a supply.
But can you tell us anything about how alcohol gets into prisons rather than drugs? I was just using the example of what we've been hearing about drugs, but how does alcohol?
I don't think, to my knowledge, that there is much in the way of alcohol coming into the prison. I think Craig will be able to speak to that it tends to, there is illegal hooch. They will brew it up themselves. There's obviously the risk there of producing methanol, which, you know, but the big problem in Russia, for example, with illegal alcohol and methanol, we know can cause blindness, can cause coma, can cause death. So there's a risk there. But to my knowledge, there are not large quantities of alcohol coming into the prison setting.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to come in? No? Okay.
Yeah, I would just agree that I've never been aware of an alcohol find or any patient's report of it coming in. It's all brewed within the cell, as you say, a hooch. It's made within the cell, which sometimes we had a Christmas batch in Glenacle just prior to Christmas, which was particularly strong, resulted in 6 people going to hospital and 20 others needing to be monitored. But it wasn't just the alcohol. The patients were telling us that they were putting what they called tizzy dots in it, which they believed to be atizolam. We haven't yet got the toxicology back from that. So it's not as if patients will necessarily, this is alcohol and that's all I'm going to use. Sometimes other substances may go into that.
Does that then mean that for someone coming in dependent on alcohol, because they can't get access to it, that they're likely then to find something else?
Oh, I'm certainly very familiar with patients who've been purely alcohol dependent, and then, as we mentioned at the outset, that's their coping strategy for traumas and stresses. If those stresses are then unmasked because they don't have their substitute to push that down, I'm certainly familiar with patients then seeking other substances to give the same effect.
And so when they come out of prison, then they have to be managed as a drug user. When they went in, they were an alcohol user. Right.
So so there's a variation. So if some patients are only in for very short sentences and maybe only use illicit substances, whether that's spice derivatives, benzodiazepines, opiates, it may be that they just need a bit of support in the prison and we can get them off that, and it's not now a codependency on release. But there are other patients who maybe have easy access to substances in some establishments, and it's on transfer to another establishment where they're not able to get that substance anymore, is the first time they'll put their hand up for help. And they may have been using illicit substances for 6, 9, 12 months, and we now do have a new problem that we have to deal with.
Thank you. Thank you. Liam Kerr and then Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, or good morning, panel. Dr. Connell, the alcohol issues are a significant issue in prison. You referred to a 2011 report, but I think Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems have alcohol in Justice paper from 2024, which gives broadly similar figures, 63% with alcohol use disorder, 31% dependent. Dr. Connell, are the impacts on people in prison in terms of their mental and physical health of alcohol issues similar to those presenting with drug issues? And if not, how are they different, please?
That's a challenging question, probably for me to answer on my own there. But I suppose, like in the community, the health impacts of alcohol and drugs can differ. But I think I might pass that on to a colleague that works in the prison setting to comment on that more.
Well, we're both clinicians, so Katrina. So, or just the general impacts of alcohol. I think this is what's so crucial, that we've got this opportunity here when people are in the justice system, not just in prison, but in the justice system, to detect, to intervene, to produce better outcomes, which not only for that individual, but for their families and the community, to reduce reoffending, to reduce health inequalities, to reduce the cost to the system. It's like 200 million roughly per annum cost of alcohol-related crime. We've got such an opportunity here. I mean, the general impacts of alcohol, there are over 200 conditions, according to WHO, of different diseases and injuries and accidents that can happen as a consequence of alcohol. So it's devastating. It's not just alcohol withdrawal, it's not just the dependent drinking, liver disease, for example, alcohol-related brain damage, cancers, and so on. So there's such an opportunity to address the impact of alcohol whilst in the prison. It's not per se the acute drinking, it's just the impact, the damage that alcohol is doing to individuals.
Dr. Sayers.
Yeah, and really to echo that, we've mentioned whether it's drugs, whether it's alcohol, they're used as a coping strategy, it's not fun, and then the removal of either of those unmasks the same mental health problems, the same traumas. So the mental health conditions that people are suppressing with substances, be that alcohol or drugs, are the same and need to be managed in the same way once that substance isn't there. And as Leslie mentioned, both of these things bring different physical conditions. Drug injecting, we see more hepatitis, deep vein thrombosis, abscesses, such complications, and alcohol, it's the chronic liver disease, the alcohol-related brain disease. So whilst the pathologies might be slightly different, both groups are poor engagers with community health services and their GPs, so this is an opportunity to address those health issues that have gone unidentified or not managed whilst in the community. So whilst the conditions might be slightly different, the way we deal with it is very much the same.
Thank you. Dr. Sayers, I'll stay with you if you don't mind. You talked there about people using substances as a coping strategy. And we heard earlier that there's relatively little opportunity to access alcohol when in prison. But there might be access to drugs. Is there any evidence to suggest that people with alcohol issues are entering prison and replacing the alcohol with drug use whilst they're in there?
Yes, I can't give you hard numbers, but I'll almost anecdotally it. I'm aware of numerous patients. I deliver addictions clinics throughout the Forth Valley estate, and it is not uncommon. I can think of 3-4 patients in the last similar 3-4 months who have transferred from another establishment where they were admitted with only alcohol dependency, never had an illicit use history, and due to no availability of alcohol and easy availability of certain substances, buprenorphine, an illicit opiate, they became daily dependent on buprenorphine on transfer to our establishments, and there is a significant variation in buprenorphine, the oral version prescribed across the estate. We're hoping with MAT standards we'll get some more uniformity to move towards the injectable preparation, which cannot be diverted. But there are certain establishments where they still are high prescribers of the oral form. So on transfer to a prison with low prescribing of that, suddenly this patient's not able to access, as I mentioned, not able to access that substance and put their hand up for help. And that's when you get the history from the patient that after a month of being into prison, I started this, and for the last 6, 9, 12 months, I've been using that daily. So I certainly have a significant number of patients where there was no pre-custody illicit dependency, but that has developed within prison.
Thank you. Dr. Graham, following on from that point, then, I'd like to ask you around consistency of support throughout the prison system for those with alcohol use disorders. Your submission suggests that there is not a consistency of support throughout the entire estate and refers to things like a lack of overarching standards and accountability. Could you tell us just how inconsistent you think that the provision is, and what solutions do you think need to be put in place? And you specifically refer to mutual aid and peer recovery networks, which I think the committee would be particularly interested in.
Thanks. Yes, well, when the Prison Healthcare Network was set up back in 2011, when the NHS took on prison healthcare, and I was involved with that, we actually came up with a set of guidelines, a sort of model of care for substance misuse, drugs and alcohol. That's no longer extant. It sounds like it's been replaced by the TOM to an extent. The monitoring of the TOM that Craig mentioned is a self-assessment, so it's not necessarily hard and fast. The DAISY, which is the system for drug and alcohol specialist treatment, which is run by Public Health Scotland, that's up and running and prisons are involved with that. That should be able to tell you the number of referrals into specialist alcohol services. It should be able to sort of follow that person's case episode, if you like, including transfer from prisons. This is in theory. And it should also be able to follow that person through, if they're still in an alcohol specialist treatment, out into the community for release, care, continuity of care. Now, I'm not aware of that system being reported fully. We can certainly look at the number going into specialist treatment, and we can look at the waiting times to get into that specialist treatment, but that journey through is not there. And that's back to what I was saying earlier on about data gaps. So if we had that data, we'd be able to get a much better picture of what actually is happening. And in terms of governance and accountability, in our report, Alcohol and Justice, that SHAP produced, we mapped out the whole justice system. And I think that's important to remember. I know that the focus for this committee is the prison setting, but it's a whole system. And one of the things that we'd rather do is not have so many people going into a prison system which is under extreme pressure and stress. So looking at opportunities earlier on to detect, possibly intervene and signpost into treatments and so on. So things like diversion and liaison and diversion, community payback orders and so on. In terms of how do we know what's happening in the system as a whole, throughout the system, there are different parts of it have different governance arrangements, which we've set out in our report. And His Majesty's Inspectorate does inspect every prison, and for the health standards, it's Healthcare Improvement Scotland that they do that in partnership with. But I think what we're calling for in SHAP is to try and get a whole system governance and accountability in place, and critically one that's transparent, so that there is reporting to the public-facing reporting of what is going on and what's not going on. And we're calling for Scottish Government to take a lead on that. There is, I've since discovered recently, a cross-portfolio group that meets around health and justice, but unlike the previous Health and Collaboration Improvement Board, where there were public minutes available, I certainly could not find any records of meetings. Another positive improvement that's happened over the last 2 years is that each health board and health and social care partnership is required to have an executive lead for health and justice, and they meet 6 monthly, and they've got input from prison governors and others, Police Scotland and so on. So that's a real welcome improvement. But again, I could not find any record of any public public records of minutes of meetings and plans and so on. the Scottish Government is coming up with a national specification for drugs and alcohol. In other words, as to what is expected across drug and alcohol services in Scotland. We're still waiting for that. That should be coming out this year. And what we're calling for is that they use that as an opportunity to develop standards right across the justice system. So that's our proposal for tightening up, if you like, governance and accountability.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Would you mind just saying something, just because you've mentioned it here in the 2020 Cochrane review, about the mutual aid and peer recovery networks? Because Cochrane seems to find that that's very positive, and I think you're suggesting that that's specifically something that needs to be more prevalent.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, we heard last session about the important role of the third sector, the non-NGOs, and there's certainly an appetite for AA to get into the prisons and also other recovery providers and also setting up a recovery cafes, but also that helps with the continuity of care, because if you're already in a recovery community within the prison setting, you can then make those contacts to a recovery community once you're released. Absolutely, and I think it's back to the difficulty with getting time to get in there, the space to get in there, escorts to and from the space that they go into. But we certainly know that from SHAP that the AA and other mutual aid networks are very keen to do as much as they can.
Very grateful. Convener.
Okay, thank you. Rhona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I want to start, Dr Sawyers, you were, in your opening statement, and if I understood it correctly, you kind of alluded to the fact there may be a kind of a postcode lottery to the service provision. Would that be true? Do you think there is?
Yes. So certainly the key criteria that we want all prisons to deliver. At the initial assessment, there was quite a significant variability as to where prisons were at that time. As I say, every 6 months we're now seeing an improvement. There's still a couple of shortfalls, but we've got to realise that these requests to improve are amongst a long list of things to improve and competing interests. But it's heartening to see the improvement, not just in this area, in other areas as well. But yes, there's variation in certain prisons.
And are you getting enough information on prisoners on admission about their condition, or are you finding that that the records aren't maybe up to date, that someone may have an alcohol problem but it's not been recorded?
No, I think the admission process is very good at identifying problems. Patients, by and large, do not tend to feel the need to hide any alcohol or drug use from healthcare staff. As a rule of thumb, they're actually looking for help, particularly if there's experiencing withdrawals. The admission process is electronic these days. I'm not very IT savvy, but it basically walks you through the admission process, which includes drug and alcohol sections. So you can't forget to ask them. There's sort of a push button where you have to answer.
Great. Dr Connell, you mentioned that, I think you said estimated 73% of people going to prison would have an alcohol problem. That's high, and I'm just wondering, Dr Sayers, are there enough practitioners around to deal with that, and is there a waiting list for you to help people when you know they need, they can't just suddenly cut off, they need withdrawal treatment?
Yeah, so I think from a withdrawal treatment point of view, nobody is missed. So every patient is seen first night by a nurse. We use the objective assessment tools to measure withdrawals and initiate treatment if that's required. The following day, those patients have a fuller assessment. Patients don't want to go into a half-an-hour admission when they've been at court all day. We do the must-do things that night, which includes identifying acute withdrawals. There's a fuller consultation the following day where that patient may not have been in withdrawals on arrival to custody, but they may have developed them overnight. So it's a second opportunity to initiate treatment. Then they are picked up by the substance use team to undertake those FAST and audit scores to identify problem drinking, at which point we're offering harm reduction brief interventions, but also trying to engage those patients into ongoing support and further psychosocial interventions if that patient's going to be with us for a longer period. This is my worry where we will miss patients for a couple of reasons. If a patient's in for a 2-3 week remand, they may not want to engage at that point. By that 2 or 3 weeks, they may be physically fine. They may transfer establishment, go to court, come back with another sentence, and suddenly they're in the system, but may now not be on somebody's radar because they've moved establishment and are not presenting acutely as unwell. So we need to identify a better way where those fast and audit tools who identify problem drinking patients who are looking for help, that we keep them engaged in help. That then brings other issues. If we have significant numbers, and we will have, of patients who are suitable for healthcare intervention on an ongoing basis, who want that, the infrastructure and the prison regime is limiting what we can deliver. You know, in several days in this. Yeah.
Is there enough being done within the justice system to help?
So barriers and frustrations for all of us. I'll speak as a GP who does my general clinics and the pain and alcohol clinics. I know how many patients I can list a day. I'm available to consult all day, but the prison regime is such that in the morning, I could be seeing patients from 8 AM, but by what they call moving the route, getting people to the work party or purposeful activity or education, that takes precedence. So it's maybe 9 o'clock when I'll start getting patients, maybe beyond that. And then 11, 11:15, patients are moving back, they have to be fed, they do lock-up numbers, they have to have exercise, and then in the afternoon, move back to their afternoon purposeful activity, maybe 2 o'clock before I'm seeing patients again. These are, and so you're missing big chunks of the day. So but there are some prisons where they facilitate patients to us all through the day. So if there could be an assurance that we have patient delivery through the day, that means we're more efficient in use of our time. It means that we're not having 10 people trying to deliver clinics in 6 rooms during this 2-hour window of opportunity. We could spread them throughout the day, exploring digital IT, in-cell telephony, if there are periods when I can't get prisoners. The focus group sessions I mentioned for the Tom, that was an ask from the patient group as well. They were looking for in-cell communication and telephone communication, replicating what happens outside. So if we could be more efficient, we don't need more staff, we don't need more money, we're just not wasting time.
No, that's interesting. And do you have any contact with families?
Not really. No, if I'm being honest, within the prison. I've attended as part of the Death in Custody group work with families outside, but I wouldn't say on a day-to-day basis. Okay. No, I do.
Thank you. Can I have one more question? Dr. Connell, you mentioned in your submission that the number of alcohol and drugs in the community payback orders was not really being reflected. You know, and I wonder if you could say a bit more than that. Is that something you think is being neglected in terms of when payback orders are given, that there doesn't seem to be any direction for recovery?
I think there's quite a few challenges in the use of the community payback orders. So they're a community sentence that are given, and they can be made up of a number of requirements, most commonly like supervision, social work supervision, but they can include other things: alcohol, drug treatment, mental health treatment, unpaid work, and offending behaviour programmes. So I observed that in the 2023-24 figures that only 1% of community payback orders included an alcohol treatment requirement, similar for drugs, and only 0.1 for mental health. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people on a community payback order are not receiving support. They may well be still accessing support or supported by their social worker. But I suppose in some of the more qualitative work that I've done, there is an issue, I think, where some people do face extreme barriers to accessing support independently, and have talked about, not in large numbers, but for some people, appreciating being mandated to attend. That then enabled them to say to their peers, I wasn't choosing to do this, but I've been told to. And others then reflecting that actually that was actually really good. So I think for some people they're potentially beneficial, but the reason that they're not used more, I've only got kind of anecdotal reports from different people about, potentially not wanting to coerce someone into treatment, although we do mandate people attend other behavioural programmes, of concerns about the quality of those treatments, concerns that they might not be available, and then you're setting someone up to not complete their order. So I would certainly be interested to know a little bit more sort of robustly why they're not used as much as they are. But another big challenge within sort of community justice is data. I mean, I would talk about data as a researcher, but knowing what the outcome of those treatment orders are, and do people successfully reduce their drinking? Do they avoid further reoffending? Is there an impact on families? Some of that data may well be out there, but it will be held at, most likely at local authority level in 32 local. No, and something like in a sort of more structured piece of research that we did looking at the international literature on mandatory drug and alcohol treatment, so where that was mandated by a court as part of a community sentence, we couldn't find any evidence that they had an impact on alcohol or drug use or health in general. That's not to say they don't, but that's to say in research people are not measuring the health impact of these health-related interventions. So similarly in Scotland we don't have that knowledge, but it would be certainly an interest of mine and the team to find that out if we could.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah. Dr. Graham, do you want to?
I'd just like to come in. Thank you. I mean, agree with everything that Katrina said. I mean, prior to community payback orders coming in, there was something called probation orders, and there were 13% of probation orders had a mention of alcohol. And then as soon as CPOs came in, it dropped to 1%, and it's been that ever since. I actually was working in the alcohol policy team for a couple of years in the Scottish Government when the legislation was being drawn up, and there was a debate, and the law actually says, the legislation says that there has to be the person has to be alcohol dependent. So that is a clinical condition with various criteria in it. So it's not hazardous or harmful drinking, it's alcohol dependency. So that needs to be diagnosed. I mean, I did try at the time to suggest, could we not broaden out to hazardous and harmful as well, because many of the sort of particularly alcohol-related crimes are due to people drinking, binge drinking and so on. We know that something like 31% of offenders say they're drunk at the time of their offence. So there's a lot of it going on. So there needs to be diagnosed. So that means you've got to send someone, if you've got the sheriff and you've got someone in front of you, you need to arrange for a clinician in a specialist service to see that person and make that diagnosis. There needs to be treatment lined up. Again, that we know that in the community there are waiting times and struggles with addiction services, so that treatment needs to be ready to go, and also critically that person needs to consent to it as well. So those are the three criteria that the Act lays down. So, and I think that because there was a move to more sort of swift, effective justice with CPOs, that was one of the sort of direction of travel of penal policy at the time. That's probably been a sort of unintended consequence of that the sheriff is trying to keep things moving along, and therefore they're not attaching an alcohol treatment requirement. And as Katrina alluded to, also there might be a reluctance to set someone up who won't be, it's not just necessarily not get the treatment, but if they can't comply with that stricter treatment order, they'll fail. That means if they breach their CPO, they'll end up in prison potentially.
Really interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks. And I suppose that speaks a little bit to some of the issues that came up in the earlier session around sort of knowledge of a person's rights, but also advocacy, so that an individual who's potentially, that there are risks associated with non-compliance of an order or a programme, then the importance of them understanding that, and perhaps where advocacy comes in. So is that something that we should maybe be looking at in terms of not just in relation to drug harm, but around alcohol harm as well?
Can I community, I think definitely, I mean, I think right, as I said earlier on, right the way through the justice system. And that's part of the work that SHAP, we've been working in sort of alcohol in the justice system for like the last 3 years. We've done desktop research, we've produced our report, we held a big symposium, about 120 or so attendees, and we're now in the phase of really trying to raise awareness, and I was pleased and very delighted that there was a debate in Parliament, we had a roundtable debate, but we're also going out to other players in the justice system, and the judiciary in particular tend not to, they've got to watch what they say and do in terms of sort of policy and so on. But we've been raising awareness of what alcohol-related harm actually is, what it looks like. We've spoken to the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, to the Judicial Institute. So things, that's a sort of reverse advocacy, if you like. We're trying to advocate that alcohol harm and people with alcohol problems in the justice system should be taken seriously, and what more could be done. I'd just like, before I leave, this is to mention coming out of prison, the Scottish Prison Service had an absolutely excellent service which was called the Through Care Support Officers. You may have heard of that. It's been formally evaluated very favourably. This is where prison officers were trained up to follow someone through the gate and act in an advocacy way when they were getting in touch with housing, trying to get work and pension organised and so on. And it was so well received by not only the services, but also those coming out of prison themselves. And unfortunately, that service was stopped. But that was a really positive example of advocacy.
Okay, thank you. Rhona, do you want to come back in?
I forgot to ask Dr. Sayers at the time. Do you have an approximate kind of gender balance of the people that you are helping to treat, male to female ratio?
Within the Scottish prison population, it's around 5% that are women. So
5%.
Yeah. Within our Forth Valley, it just so happens we've got HMP Stirling, formerly Coniston Vale. So we receive all women in Scotland, apart from those very north who go to the local prison. So we are the receiving for females. Most will now transfer to Polmont, which is again within our catchment area. So we have a disproportionately high female to male number compared to other places.
But it's still disproportionate to male.
But it's still a small, So Glenorchal's 800 all males.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I wonder if I can maybe just come in on and ask a little bit about your views on the prison services alcohol and drugs strategy. I don't think we've covered that yet. I may have missed it, but before I do so, Leslie, you made a comment just in one of your last responses there about, asking the question what more can be done. And perhaps who that should involve. I don't want to go off at a complete tangent, but I'm just interested in whether or not the industry has a role, given the context within which you were discussing issues around alcohol harm today.
You mean the alcohol industry? I don't believe, and we don't believe in SHAP, that the alcohol industry should be involved in developing any sort of health policy. I think there's a conflict of interest there. I mean, you'll probably know that we in SHAP came up with, amongst others, with the idea of minimum unit pricing for alcohol in our report in 2007. And we worked really hard to advocate for MUP to be brought in. And thankfully, we had a sort of visionary government that saw the potential of that. And that was a real struggle. And I have to say that the alcohol industry were the ones that then took us to court. So I suppose I'm, from personal experience, rather wary of bringing in the alcohol industry, particularly into such a vulnerable population. So that's my personal view.
Thank you. I wonder if I can come back to the prison services alcohol and drug recovery strategy that I mentioned a moment ago. And I'm interested in the panel's views on whether you feel the alcohol aspect of that strategy is sufficiently addresses the issues that we've been talking about this morning already. Should alcohol harm be subject perhaps of a separate approach? And I suppose are the policies and guidance that are all already in place, and we know there's a lot of them, are they really translating into sort of consistent practice? We've maybe sort of touched on this already in relation to consistency and sustainability of services. And also, is there sufficient understanding, particularly amongst health professionals who are perhaps dealing with and supporting people impacted by alcohol harm? Is there sufficient sort of expertise, understanding, training around people, health professionals who are supporting that sort of cohort of the population in prisons? So there's a few questions in there, but I'm interested in, just how well the strategy is working. Craig, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll hand to you shortly. But yeah, in terms of the strategy, it's quite a high-level document and really gives a sort of general and holistic aspirational approach. In a similar way to the TOM, this is where we want to be future state, but I find it doesn't have detail that would be helpful for other services. So it's holistic in terms of mixing drug and alcohol, and this is the services that wish to be provided. And without going into detail, there's probably not a great benefits to that strategy separating drugs and alcohol, because it's such a high-level comments. It covers both. I think in terms of what would be desirable from a healthcare perspective is if the strategy had a few more details about what the Scottish Prison Service staff were going to be delivering themselves, because it does make many reference to working with partners, whether that's third sector agencies, healthcare staff, but it doesn't really specify this is what we will do. And without knowing that, it makes it very challenging for health boards. We're all on a restricted budget. We're all trying to manage many conditions in prison, but who do we employ? And only when we know what will be delivered by other agencies, be that SPS or third sector organisations, can we recruit appropriately. So if there are low-level psychosocial interventions, brief interventions going to be delivered by operational staff as part of their strategy, then we can focus on higher level specialist expertise. But if that's not going to be delivered by SPS, boards will have to cut their cloth accordingly and recruit staff to cover that level of intervention, which may then reduce the higher level specialist intervention available.
So on that then, MAT standards, so obviously we've got a set of MAT standards with regard to tackling and addressing drug harm. Is there something worth looking at with regard to almost having a set of MAT standards, probably quite a crude question, with regard to alcohol?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, the MAT standards, we're going through a MAT standards almost thematic group just now, because they probably need to look slightly different in prison for several reasons. One, as I mentioned, the bullying, concealment, diversion of oromucosal buprenorphine. There's certainly nice recommendations that in high-risk environments of that, there should be a move towards the injectable buprenorphine. Most prisons do that already, but I think it would be good within our MAT standards to have definitive guidance to prescribers. This is the preparation you should be using. I see no reason why we don't have similar parallel standards with regards to alcohol prescribing. We've got the assessments at the start and how to prescribe on a fixed dose regime to deal with withdrawals, but that introduction of treatment at the end, this Camprel and Antabuse are really the two common things. Antabuse should be initiated under specialist services. I understand why there may be some reluctance from doctors without that expertise. You know, most prisons are covered by GPs, often locum GPs, where alcohol dependency is not their speciality. Camprel is used to diminish cravings, and so there's a lean to most of us to prescribe that because it's quite safe if you did drink on top of it. Whereas if you were to be initiated on Antabuse, and what level of confidence do we have that our patients may not return to alcohol on release because they've had a forced abstinence, and then the minute they walk out the door, it's available everywhere. And if you drink on top of Antabuse, you know, it can cause flushing, collapse, even death. So I can get how some prescribers may pull back from that. So if we had more specialist input at that stage, they may be happy to say, look, we'll initiate that, and as the patient comes out, they're coming to this specialist service. So even MAT standards having identified specialist community services, that better link with ADPs. But I think, yeah, we could have prescriptive guidance for alcohol management, particularly at the ends of the journey.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't want to hog the floor, but just on a final question from myself. Obviously, you may have been aware in the previous panel, we heard about the challenges around release, with specifically in relation to access to housing, that sort of continuity of care, and going back into that environment and peer group that perhaps was a contributory factor to you coming into prison. I'm just interested in whether or not there are the same challenges associated with alcohol harm. If you care to comment on
Yeah,
that.
very much so. The homeless accommodation, patients will tell us that it's not even going to their peer group, it's going to other patients presenting as homeless. Drink is all around. And if you've got an alcohol dependency, it is incredibly hard in that early stage to refrain from returning to alcohol use. So yeah, that risk, homelessness is a huge risk factor. I think just to briefly mention, because I know we've not quite touched on it, one population that's at huge risk is the remand population, because that's where we have problems in both drug and alcohol, particularly some of the short-term remands. Those patients might come in withdrawing, we initiate a treatment, they may be at court in the following day or the day after. Very often some of these remands are incredibly short. I do not see how it's feasible for a patient released from court on remand who's actually mid-alcohol withdrawal to not return to alcohol. So there are no court services, and in an ideal world, we call it an airport lounge when we discuss it. If there was something sort of at court for those released for drug and alcohol, somewhere where there could be an area where they could be addressing housing benefits, their current active acute medical problems. And that's not just unique to prisons, that's from people going from police to there as well. So I just think there's a missed opportunity for a huge group of patients that we have a chance to pull them into services. I know that's not a cheap option, but a desirable one.
And talking about services, I'm interested in what specific support is provided by Upside, the National Through Care Service, and other third sector providers in terms of those who use substances and their... Oh, hang on, I think I'm just going into the wrong question. Yeah, sorry, I'm looking at a question that I set out earlier on, and I've got my numbers muddled up. So I wonder if you could tell the committee anything about the prison to rehab pathway. For example, is this used in practice for those that have alcohol use disorders in prison, and what residential and community recovery models are there available in the community for people using alcohol? Is that something that you're...
Yeah, so yeah. I asked my team to give me numbers, if they had them, about prison to rehab, specifically for alcohol. Mm-hmm. I'm going to leave Leslie to give the big numbers because I know she's got those. But I hold a weekly meeting with my 3 prisons online to address new prescriptions, changes in prescriptions, patients of concern. And I am conscious that somebody going to rehab for alcohol is not something I hear very much, if anything, about. You know, I will start patients on Camprel or Antabuse, but I'm not really hearing the chat about it. So I asked to get the numbers back, what's available. So there are 10 rehabs available. There was a comment and ask about what about access to remote and rural areas. My geography is not great, but there is one in the Hebrides, so there is certainly some remote and rural access there. But from our 2 biggest prisons, Polmont and Glenorchy, my substance lead informed me today that they've never, from those 2 prisons, referred somebody to rehab for alcohol specifically. So I'm going to pass to Leslie, who's got much better numbers.
So the prison to rehab pathway, which set up in, so I think it's 2021, is monitored by Public Health Scotland. So they do produce reports that say how many places have been funded, and there's different funding sources. So from April 21 to end of March 2025, there were 3,266 placements overall, that's community and prison. And I think, and I did email them, but I haven't heard back yet, I think there was, out of those 3,266, 186 prison to rehab places. The community rehab places are, this is for residential rehab overall, as part of the drugs mission and so on, they are broken down by substance of use. So you can get breakdown by alcohol and drugs, and actually the slight majority is for alcohol. But unfortunately, the prison to rehab data is not broken down by type of substance. So whether or not they can do that, but it's certainly not reported. So what I could do is maybe follow that up with Public Health Scotland and get back to the committee and see if they can break that down.
It'd be really interesting just to know a little bit more about the detail and the breakdown of that. So that would be welcome. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, enough from me. I'm going to bring in Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. We talked, Dr O'Connell, you mentioned data or the lack of earlier. I'm just wondering if there's any data being collected on deaths in custody due to alcohol, or deaths are, directly or indirectly related and after release. Do we have any data on that?
So, any death in custody would be subject to a fatal accident inquiry, so that would look into the causes and the context. And a review by some colleagues at the University of Glasgow did a thematic review of deaths in custody, and in none of those did they specify alcohol. In a number of them, substance use is identified, but it doesn't break that down by substance. So I think it's, given the lesser availability of alcohol in custody, it's probably unlikely that alcohol is the main cause there, although there will be people with alcohol problems in those numbers. In terms of release from custody, so we've done some preliminary work looking at our cohort, and we found that in the 4 years following release, about 9% of people will have lost their lives in the 4 years post-release, and over half of them are substance use related. So we haven't yet broken that down by drugs or alcohol, but given the sort of complex needs of the population, lots of use of multiple substances and co-occurring mental health problems, it's probably there, but we haven't done that yet. But when we compared that to a sort of similar group of people who hadn't been in prison, that was 3.6, about 4 times more likely, and that's similar to the data that was done by Leslie and colleagues published in 2015 that found that drugs and alcohol, and I think it was mental health related deaths were the most common causes, and about 4 times the rate of the
extrapolated to alcohol solely for cause of death. And Dr Sears, do you have any follow-up on the work you do on that?
Yeah, so again, drifting from alcohol, one of my concerns was I've been working in prisons for 25 years. I know I don't look old enough. But people never died of a drug death. In the first 10, 12 years, it was unheard of. But in the last 5, 10 years, it's become a thing, and it's become a worrying thing. We've sort of numbers from nothing to 2 to 5 to 7 to 14. And that's a reflection, not really of alcohol, of the toxicology post-mortem results. Alcohol's never really come back to us. It's the newer synthetic cannabinoids. It's the longer-acting, more potent benzodiazepines. The opiate is still the key drug identified, but we know fentanyl's now into the system. Nitazines are increasing findings. Some of the nitazines are 500 times the strength of heroin. So our patients, although we're educating them, they're kind of not really thinking, oh, I'll just take a 500th of what I usually take then. So it's more, we are identifying opiates as our great concern. We are hoping and working with the Scottish Prison Service to encourage officers to use nasal naloxone. There's been some fantastic work done by officers I saw in Lomos who carried body cameras, and you saw them in action using it. And I'm hoping it mirrors what the police have done, where there is a confidence, and maybe a couple of years down the line, officers will all carry this without even batting an eyelid, but there's a journey to get there. But in terms of alcohol being the direct death that we see, no, that's not coming up on the Scottish Prisons drug data.
Okay.
So it's very drug-based.
Okay, thank you. Next convener.
Okay, thank you. Fulton McGregor, I'll bring you in.
Thanks, thanks, convener. Good afternoon to the panel. The question I'm going to ask, you've already all touched on in your answers, but it just gives you an opportunity to put anything additional on the record in response to quite a specific question. So folk who are leaving prison, go back to the community, is there any differences in terms of the support needs for those with an alcohol use disorder as opposed to those with other substance misuse issues? Is there anything that specifically we should know about alcohol misuse?
I think one big difference between immediately post-release is the risk of death from drug use, the risk of an overdose. That is not the case so much with alcohol, although Craig's alluded to if you've got antabuse, there's a potential risk of death. So I think that's one of the major things, and that's why we've been pouring lots of effort nationally into providing naloxone on release from prisons, and that's really ramped up, and Scottish Drug Forum have been doing lots of peer support for all of that. But I think beyond that, the support needs, apart from having a specialist treatment, which will be different to drugs from alcohol and the different health needs that we've outlined, because the drivers of drug misuse are often the same as that of alcohol misuse. It's childhood trauma. I mean, 1 in 4 of the people in prison say they've been care experienced. 1 in 2 say that they've had physical abuse as a child. So that high level of trauma, social exclusion, poverty, unemployment and so on, driving people to substance misuse will also be there when they come out of the gate, and the mental health, the housing. So I think whilst there are important differences, I think there were as many, if not more, similarities. I just wanted to maybe go back to the point about alcohol deaths. I did have a look. There was a big review of deaths in custody done in 2021 by the then Inspectorate of Prisons, and then a Deaths in Prisons Action Group was set up by Scottish Government following that, and did do a deep dive into the data. So from 2012 to 22, there were 350 deaths in custody in prison. Many of those were called natural deaths. It doesn't mean to say it's natural to be dying age 50 from a heart attack or that sort of thing, but 48 of those were poisonings. And although they didn't say that there was no alcohol, I think majority, if not all, were due to drugs. So there's some hard facts. I've also checked in with Public Health Scotland, which now gets data from the prison service on a regular basis every quarter. It gets the PR2, which is the prison administration system, and they have got permissions to link that to not just health data, but mortality data. So they've got the potential, if you did want to ask the question, looking at alcohol-related deaths post-prison release by time period, they can do that analysis. That was, Katrina kindly alluded to some research that I'd led on when I was working in the prison service, and we did look at that, and there were more drug deaths, but there were alcohol deaths in the population post-release. So that's something the committee may wish to follow up. I can find out if you wish.
That is very interesting, I think, just in response to your question.
That's good.
Okay, thank you for that. Katrina, you want to come in?
Just briefly going to come in on community support for people specifically with alcohol needs. And I think one of the challenges, as everyone's, is it's not just alcohol, there's lots of other things going on, and services are not necessarily set up to cope with that. They're not optimally set up for people who maybe are also trying to find a place to live, and their address might change, and things are potentially quite disrupted in their lives. So services often find it challenging to flex and roll with that, which can make it difficult for people then to sustain their engagement. And I did some work outside of the Central Belt, in not rural and remote, but out in areas more remote than Glasgow, Edinburgh. And one of the challenges there was the consistency of what was available, and particularly support for and from people with lived experience. And that there were some pockets of the country, this was in the sort of the northeast, where there just wasn't anything like Alcoholics Anonymous that they could get to, unless they had a car and travelled an hour or so to the nearest city. So there's some pockets where there's I suppose, missing services, but there are also some communities where what they don't want is peer support, and there's some different cultures around access to that. So there's definitely a need for many things for many people, but services that can cope with people who are dealing with quite challenging circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's an interesting point at the end there. Thank you. Okay, I think we're just coming up to time, unless any other members want to come in with any questions, and I'll maybe open up to the panel for any final comments that you maybe want to make that we've maybe not covered just before we conclude at all. Sharon, sorry.
Just a small question going back to help and support within the prisons. It's for Dr Graham. In the written submission from SHAP, it mentions that the 2024 prisoner survey, 6% of respondents received support when they arrived in prison for alcohol consumption, said it was helpful, but 3% received support, said it wasn't helpful. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about if you've got any detail on why they didn't think it was helpful.
No, I don't have any detail. Sorry, it's self-report by prisoners themselves, and the prisoner survey does. I mean, it's been a great thing. It was set up in the late 80s when there was sort of a lot of unrest in the prison, and it's almost like it was to try and understand why that unrest had built up and what they could do going forward. So it's been a tremendous thing over the last 20, 30 years, and we managed to put health questions in there, like the audit score for alcohol. We had that. We were also measuring well-being and so on. But over time, and it's a paper-based system, the response rate has fallen right down to 30%, which in a scientific perspective is less robust than one would hope for. And also the drug and alcohol sections are within that survey of those who are responding tend not to be fully complete. So I wouldn't put much on what I could draw, say or not say. I think I would be looking to more routine data, like the drug and alcohol waiting times, and also looking at the Barlini Inspectorate report from November 2024, and prisoners themselves were reporting long waits for addiction services and so on. But I think I would agree with what Craig said earlier on, that the admission process, it's written into prison rules as well, is really quite robust. But equally echoing that the first thing when someone's coming in is not really thinking, I must bring up my alcohol problem, you know. So I think it's a bit like going round and round in a spiral to keep revisiting prisoners during their progression to see if now's the time for them to bring it up and seek some help.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, on that, I'll bring this session to a close. Thank you very, very much for attending this morning. I think we've picked up a lot of very, very helpful details. So next week we'll be continuing to take evidence as part of the inquiry, and we'll be focusing on prevention and enforcement. So on that, we'll move on to private session. Thank you.